They were built to last millennia, and then suddenly, deliberately closed. Across the ancient world, powerful civilizations constructed magnificent gates, monumental thresholds between the living and something far less understood. Some were sealed after a single discovery. Others locked away after events history refuses to fully explain. These weren't accidents, these were decisions. 10 gates, 10 mysteries, each one hiding something that made the people who found it say, "Never again." What did they uncover? What still waits behind those stones? So, sit back, relax, and let's step through history together. Carefully. In the southernmost reaches of India, where the Arabian Sea breathes warm and heavy against the Malabar coast, stands a temple so old that its origins blur into mythology. The Padmanabhaswamy temple rises above the city of Thiruvananthapuram in Kerala, a structure of staggering beauty, its towering gopuram reaching toward the sky in tiers of intricately carved stone, each surface alive with figures of gods, serpents, and celestial beings frozen in eternal devotion. For centuries, this temple has been one of the wealthiest and most sacred Hindu shrines in the world. Pilgrims travel enormous distances just to stand within its outer courtyard, to feel the weight of something ancient and uninterrupted pressing against the present moment. The air inside is thick with incense, chanted prayer, and a particular kind of silence, the kind that comes not from emptiness, but from accumulated reverence. But beneath the surface of this sacred place, something has always waited. In 2011, a court-appointed committee made a discovery that would shock the world. Following a legal dispute over the temple's administration, the Supreme Court of India ordered an official audit of the vaults located beneath its inner sanctum. One by one, heavy stone doors were opened, doors that had not swung on their hinges in generations. What the committee found inside would become one of the most astonishing treasure revelations in recorded history. Vault A, Vault B, Vault C, Vault D, Vault E, Vault F. 5 of those chambers yielded treasures beyond imagination. Gold coins dating back more than 1,000 years, diamonds the size of thumbnails, ceremonial crowns encrusted with precious stones, solid gold idols, necklaces of extraordinary craftsmanship, bags of gemstones so numerous they had to be weighed rather than counted individually. The total estimated value of what was found in those 5 chambers alone exceeded $15 billion, possibly far more. It was, by most accounts, the single largest collection of valuables ever discovered in one place in human history. And yet, even in that moment of breathtaking revelation, one door remained closed. Vault B. Of all the chambers beneath the Padmanabhaswamy temple, Vault B stands apart. Not because of what has been found inside, but because of what has not. Unlike the other vaults, which were opened without incident during the 2011 audit, Vault B presented something unusual from the very beginning. Its entrance is not secured by a conventional lock or a traditional bar. Instead, the door, carved from solid iron, is said to be sealed in a manner that defies easy mechanical explanation. According to those who have examined it closely, the door appears to have no visible bolts, hinges, or locking mechanism on its exterior. What holds it shut, some scholars and temple priests have long maintained, is not a physical fastening at all. It is a Naga bandham, a serpent seal, an ancient Sanskrit incantation, according to Hindu scriptural tradition, that was spoken over the door centuries ago by powerful sages, binding it shut through sacred sound and divine authority. The belief, passed through generations of temple custodians, is that this door can only be opened by a scholar with the precise knowledge and spiritual standing required to perform the corresponding ritual, a Garuda mantra, and that to open it through any other means would be to invite catastrophic consequences. This is where history and tradition begin to separate, and where the mystery deepens considerably. The Archaeological Survey of India and several structural engineers who have inspected the vault's exterior have offered more grounded assessments. They suggest the door's unusual construction may simply reflect ancient engineering techniques not immediately recognizable to modern eyes, that what appears to be a seamless surface may conceal recessed mechanisms operated through methods now lost to institutional knowledge. But then, there are those who point to something else entirely. Reports from within the temple's own priestly community, accounts passed down through oral tradition, and in some cases, documented in regional historical records, describe sounds emanating from behind Vault B. Not the sounds of settling stone or temperature-shifting metal. Sounds, some have claimed, resembling water or movement. Or, in the most unsettling accounts, something less easily categorized. These claims are unverified. They exist at the edge of testimony, in that uncertain space between personal experience and documented evidence. But they are not easily dismissed by those who heard them firsthand, and they have never been fully explained. The Supreme Court of India ultimately ruled that Vault B should not be opened. The reasoning cited in official proceedings was layered. There were concerns about structural integrity, the possibility that centuries of sealed atmosphere within the chamber could have created conditions incompatible with sudden exposure to air or light. There were religious objections from the temple's hereditary trustees, the Travancore royal family, who argued that disturbing the seal would violate sacred protocols with consequences that no legal body had the authority to authorize. And there was, perhaps most significantly, a broader cultural hesitation. An unspoken acknowledgement that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. The court appointed a 7-member oversight committee. It deliberated. It considered expert testimony from historians, engineers, and religious scholars. And in the end, it agreed. Vault B would remain sealed. What then might actually be inside? This is the question that has captured the imagination of historians, archaeologists, and independent researchers for more than a decade. The 5 open chambers yielded treasures that spanned nearly 2 millennia of accumulated offerings, wealth donated by kings, merchants, and devotees across generations who believed that what they gave to the god Vishnu could not be reclaimed by any earthly hand. If those chambers held $15 billion in artifacts and precious materials, the reasoning follows that Vault B, consistently described in temple records as the largest and most significant of all the subterranean chambers, could hold something comparable or greater. But others have proposed something far more intriguing than gold. Some researchers, drawing on fragmentary temple manuscripts and the observations of 18th century travelers who documented the region's sacred sites, have suggested that Vault B may contain something other than conventional treasure. Ancient texts of extraordinary rarity, astronomical instruments of a sophistication that would reframe our understanding of early Indian science, artifacts whose origin and purpose are, as yet, entirely unknown. There is a school of thought, held cautiously by a small but serious segment of scholars, that the Padmanabhaswamy temple was built not merely as a house of worship, but as a vault of knowledge. That the treasures stored beneath it were not simply gifts to the divine, but a deliberate archive, objects and documents preserved across centuries precisely because someone, somewhere, believed they needed to survive. There is one detail that resists easy resolution, and that lingers long after all other questions have been addressed. During the initial stages of the 2011 audit, before the Supreme Court's final ruling on Vault B, at least one preliminary inspection of the chamber's exterior was conducted. According to court documents, the inspecting team reported an anomaly near the base of the sealed door, a marking, or series of markings, carved into the stone in a script that the inspectors could not immediately identify. It did not match the classical Malayalam inscriptions found elsewhere in the temple. It did not conform to standard Sanskrit epigraphy of the medieval period. Requests for further examination were noted in the official record. A follow-up analysis was recommended. As far as available public documentation reveals, that analysis has never been completed. The Padmanabhaswamy temple continues to function today exactly as it has for centuries. Prayers are offered each morning at the prescribed hours. The corridors fill with devotees. The Gopuram stands against the Kerala sky, unchanged. Somewhere beneath the stone floors, behind an iron door that no modern hand has opened, something waits. Whether it is gold or manuscripts or instruments of an ancient science, or simply empty darkness that has accumulated a mythology far larger than itself, no one alive today can say with certainty, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. Not that we don't know what is inside Vault B, but that we chose not to look. What does it mean when humanity, standing at the threshold of a genuine mystery, decides that some answers are simply too dangerous or too sacred to pursue? India is not alone in this. Across the ancient world, in cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time, the same impulse appears again and again, the need to seal something away, to close a door and declare, with absolute finality, that what lies beyond it is not meant for ordinary eyes. Sometimes the reasons were religious, sometimes political. Sometimes they reflected a fear that modern language struggles to adequately name. And sometimes the door in question sits beneath a mound of earth so vast it was mistaken for a mountain. In the heart of China's Shanxi province, roughly 30 miles east of the city of Chichén, there is a hill that does not quite belong to the landscape around it. It rises too deliberately, its slopes are too symmetrical. It stands apart from the surrounding plain with a kind of quiet authority that even the most casual observer tends to notice without fully understanding why. For centuries, local farmers worked the fields around it. Dynasties rose and fell. Armies marched past it, and the hill simply waited, as it has waited for more than 2,000 years, above the most elaborately constructed tomb in the history of human civilization. Beneath that hill lies the burial complex of Qin Shi Huang, the man who, in 221 BC, became the first emperor of a unified China. And at its center, sealed behind a stone gate that has not been opened in over 2 millennia, rests something that archaeologists, historians, and scientists have studied, theorized about, and ultimately agreed to leave untouched. For now. Qin Shi Huang was not a modest man. He was, by almost any historical measure, one of the most consequential figures who ever lived. In the span of roughly 2 decades, he dismantled the fragmented warring states period and forged a single empire from its ruins. He standardized weights, measures, currency, and written script across a territory of staggering size. He connected existing defensive walls into what would eventually become the Great Wall. He built roads. He reformed law. He created, essentially from the violence of conquest, the administrative foundations of a civilization that would endure for more than 2,000 years. And from the moment he assumed power, some accounts suggest from as early as age 13, he began building his tomb. The project consumed an estimated 700,000 laborers over nearly 4 decades. It was not merely a burial chamber. It was, according to historical records compiled by the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, writing roughly a century after the emperor's death in 210 BC, an entire underground world. Sima Qian's account is detailed and extraordinary. He describes a vast subterranean palace beneath the burial mound, its ceiling inlaid with pearls and precious stones arranged to represent the constellations of the night sky. He describes rivers and seas, rendered in flowing mercury, the element the emperor believed held the secret of immortality, mechanically circulated through the chamber in perpetual motion. He describes bronze coffins, weapons, and treasures of incalculable value. He describes crossbow traps, engineered to fire automatically at anyone who might attempt to enter uninvited. For most of modern history, scholars treated portions of Sima Qian's account as literary embellishment, the kind of mythologizing that naturally accumulates around figures of tremendous power. Then, in 1974, a group of farmers drilling a well a little over a mile from the burial mound broke through into something unexpected. What they found was the first pit of the Terracotta Army. More than 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers, individually crafted with distinct facial features, weapons, and armor. Horses, chariots, officers, positioned by rank. An entire military force, frozen in formation, standing guard in the darkness for more than 2,000 years. The discovery was seismic. It confirmed that at least the broad architectural ambitions of Sima Qian's account were not exaggeration. Something enormous and deliberate and extraordinarily complex had been built here. And if the outer perimeter of the complex was this elaborate, this carefully considered, what might lie at its center? Soil samples taken from within and around the burial mound have been analyzed repeatedly over the past several decades. The results are consistent, and they are striking. Mercury concentrations in the earth above and surrounding the burial chamber are measurably, significantly elevated, far beyond what natural geological processes would produce. The mercury, in other words, appears to be there, flowing or having flowed in quantities that align with what Sima Qian described more than 2,000 years ago. The rivers are real, or were. This single finding reframed the entire conversation. It meant that the historian's account was not mythology dressed as fact, it was documentation. And if the Mercury rivers were real, then the question of what else Sima Qian described accurately became considerably more urgent. The stone gate at the entrance to the burial chamber has been located through ground-penetrating radar surveys. It sits at the end of a sealed corridor, behind layers of compacted earth and structural reinforcement that the Emperor's engineers designed specifically to resist intrusion. The gate itself is not a symbolic barrier, it is a physical one, massive, deliberately placed, and constructed to last. And yet, unlike the situation in Kerala, no court order or religious edict stands between archaeologists and the decision to open it. The gate remains sealed for a different reason entirely: science. The technology required to excavate, stabilize, and preserve what lies inside the burial chamber does not yet exist, at least not to the satisfaction of the researchers who have studied the problem most carefully. The lesson was learned painfully from the terracotta warriors themselves. When the clay soldiers were first exposed to open air after centuries of sealed darkness, many began to deteriorate almost immediately. The pigments that had preserved their original painted colors, vivid reds, greens, and blacks, began to flake and fade within minutes of exposure. Despite enormous preservation efforts, much of that color was lost forever. If the same principle applies to the burial chamber itself, and most experts believe it does, then opening the gate prematurely would be an act of irreversible destruction. Whatever is inside would be compromised, damaged, or lost before it could be properly documented or understood. The Chinese government has maintained a consistent position. The tomb will not be excavated until the science is ready. It is a position grounded in hard experience and genuine respect for what may be at stake. But it is also a position that leaves the deepest questions entirely unanswered. Because the mercury is only part of the story. Among the more compelling aspects of Sima Qian's account is his description of the tomb's construction workforce. Specifically, what happened to them when the burial was complete. According to his records, the artisans and engineers who had worked on the inner chambers were sealed inside along with the emperor's remains. The passage doors were lowered. The workers who had planted the outer trees and shrubs were prevented from leaving. The entrances were buried. The reasoning, as Sima Qian renders it, was straightforward and brutal. No one who knew the tomb's secrets could be allowed to carry that knowledge into the world. This detail has been debated by historians for generations. Some regard it as plausible, consistent with what is known of Qin Shi Huang's governance, a ruler who was not known for his tolerance of security vulnerabilities. Others view it as part of the tomb's mythological construction, a story designed to reinforce the sacred inviolability of the burial site. There is, as yet, no physical evidence that directly confirms or refutes it. The chambers have not been opened. The corridors have not been walked. What lies in the darkness behind the stone gate remains, in every meaningful sense, unknown. And this is where the more speculative currents of inquiry begin to flow, carefully but persistently. A small number of researchers, operating at the margins of mainstream archaeology, have raised questions that go beyond the practical challenges of excavation. They point to the unusual geometry of the burial mound itself, its dimensions, its precise orientation relative to specific astronomical markers, and suggest that the complex may encode information that has not yet been fully interpreted. The mound, they argue, was not simply a covering for a burial. It was a structure in its own right, designed with intention that extended beyond the purely funerary. Others have drawn attention to certain passages in texts contemporaneous with the tomb's construction that describe artifacts placed within the chamber not as offerings in the conventional sense, but as instruments. Objects intended to function, to operate, to serve a purpose in whatever existence the emperor believed awaited him. What kind of instruments? The texts are not specific. They use language that is either deliberately vague or simply reflects the limits of what the authors themselves understood. But the consistency of these references across multiple independent sources has struck some researchers as worthy of serious attention. There is also the matter of the tomb's location within the broader geography of the complex. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed that the burial mound is surrounded by an inner wall and an outer wall, a city within a city, essentially, with structures, pits, and buried artifacts distributed across a site covering nearly 38 square miles. The Terracotta Army, extraordinary as it is, represents only a small fraction of what has been found and mapped. Stables, administrative buildings, acrobats, musicians, exotic animals. An entire court rendered in miniature and buried in careful arrangement around the emperor who would rule it in death as he had in life. The stone gate in this context is not simply an entrance to a tomb. It is the threshold of an entire world, one that has been perfectly, deliberately preserved in absolute darkness for more than 2,000 years. What is the condition of what lies beyond it? This is a question that keeps certain researchers awake at night. The sealed environment, if it has maintained its integrity, may have created conditions of extraordinary preservation. Bronze objects that would have corroded in open air. Organic materials, wood, silk, paper, lacquer, that would have deteriorated over centuries of exposure. Documents, perhaps, of a kind and content that no other archive in the world contains. Qin Shi Huang was famously, obsessively interested in two things above all others: power and immortality. He sent expeditions to search for the islands of the immortals. He consumed mercury-based elixirs prepared by court alchemists who told him they could extend his life. Elixirs that most historians believe contributed to his death at 49. He consulted oracles, astronomers, and scholars of every available tradition. Is it unreasonable to wonder whether the burial chamber contains the records of those consultations? The accumulated knowledge of an empire at its most intense and focused intellectual moment, preserved in darkness, waiting? No excavation date has been announced. No timeline has been publicly committed to. The technology gap remains real, and the Chinese government's position has not shifted. The stone gate has not moved. Somewhere beneath the hill that is not quite a mountain, in a darkness that has not been broken since the 3rd century BC, the first emperor of China continues to wait. Surrounded, if Sima Qian is to be believed, by the flowing silver of Mercury rivers and the cold glitter of a sky made of gems. And the gate that separates us from all of it remains exactly where it was placed, sealed by intention, held by time, and guarded, perhaps most effectively of all, by the simple, sobering recognition that to open it carelessly would be to lose it forever. But here is the question that lingers, the one that neither science nor caution nor policy can quite resolve. What if the most significant thing inside that chamber is not gold or mercury or the preserved artifacts of a vanished dynasty? What if it is something that reframes what we thought we knew about that civilization, about that period of human history, about the lengths to which one extraordinary mind was willing to go in pursuit of something that no one, in the end, has ever truly found? The hill stands, the gate holds, and the answer, whatever it is, continues to wait in the dark. China teaches us something important. Sometimes the most powerful act is not opening a door, but choosing, with full awareness of what might lie beyond it, to leave it closed. Sometimes restraint is not timidity, it is wisdom. And sometimes the seal itself becomes the story. But not every sealed gate belongs to a tomb. Not every locked door guards the remains of a single man, however extraordinary. Some doors, according to history and tradition both, once stood at the center of an entire civilization's relationship with the divine. And some of those doors have never been found at all. There is a hill in the ancient city of Jerusalem, a place called the Temple Mount, known in Arabic as Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, that carries within it a density of human history, almost without parallel anywhere on earth. It has been fought over, preyed upon, destroyed, rebuilt, and contested across 3,000 years of recorded memory. Empires have risen and fallen in its shadow. Religions have organized themselves around it. Wars have been justified by the desire to possess it. And somewhere within its layered history, according to texts that span multiple traditions and centuries, stood a pair of bronze doors unlike anything the ancient world had ever produced. This is the story of the Temple of Solomon, and of the gates that, depending on which source you consult, were either destroyed, hidden, translated to another place entirely, or sealed away in a manner that has defied every attempt at explanation ever since. The Temple of Solomon, known in Hebrew tradition as the First Temple, is described in extraordinary detail across multiple ancient texts, most extensively in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the first book of Kings and the second book of Chronicles. According to these accounts, construction began during the reign of King Solomon, son of David, somewhere around 957 BC. The project drew on resources from across the ancient Near East, cedars from Lebanon, craftsmen from Tyre, gold from Ophir, a location whose precise geography has never been conclusively established. The building that emerged from this effort was, by the account of those who described it, a structure of absolute intentionality. Every measurement, every material, every proportion was prescribed, either by divine instruction, as the texts maintain, or by an architectural tradition of extraordinary sophistication, as secular historians tend to interpret the same evidence. At the entrance to the inner sanctuary, the space known as the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was said to reside, stood 2 doors of olive wood overlaid with gold. But the accounts that have drawn the most sustained attention over centuries of inquiry are those describing the temple's exterior bronze gates. They were cast, according to tradition, by a craftsman named Hiram of Tyre, a figure of almost legendary skill described in the texts as a master of bronze work, filled with wisdom and understanding. The gates he produced were not merely functional, they were, by every account, overwhelming. Towering structures of cast bronze, covered in relief carvings of extraordinary complexity, pomegranates, lilies, palm trees, interlocking chains, surfaces so densely worked that later writers struggled to find adequate language to describe them. 2 bronze pillars flanked the entrance to the temple. They were given names, Chichén and Boaz, which translates roughly as, "He shall establish," and "In him is strength." The naming of architectural elements was not casual in the ancient world. It was an act of theological declaration. These were not decorations, they were statements. And then, in 587 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II besieged Jerusalem, breached its walls, and burned the temple to the ground. What happened to the bronze doors in that destruction is one of the most quietly persistent mysteries in the archaeology of the ancient Near East. The historical record is specific about certain things. The Book of Kings describes Babylonian soldiers dismantling the bronze elements of the temple, the pillars, the great bronze basin known as the sea, the wheeled stands and their panels, and carrying them to Babylon. The text enumerates these objects with the careful attention of someone recording an inventory of loss. The bronze of the pillars, it notes, was beyond weighing. But the doors themselves, the great bronze entrance gates, are described differently in different sources. Some accounts include them in the general catalog of destruction and removal. Others are silent on their specific fate. And a third category of sources, drawn from traditions that developed in the centuries following the temple's destruction, suggests something else entirely. That the doors were not taken, that they were not destroyed, that they were hidden. The tradition of the hidden temple treasures is ancient and widespread. It appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically in a document known as the Copper Scroll, discovered at Qumran in 1952, which contains what appears to be a list of buried treasures and their locations, written in a Hebrew dialect distinct from the other scrolls and on copper rather than parchment, as if its contents were considered too important for ordinary material. The Copper Scroll describes gold, silver, priestly vestments, and sacred vessels concealed across dozens of locations, some identifiable, most not. It does not specifically mention the bronze doors, but it establishes, with remarkable matter-of-factness, that the preservation of sacred objects from the temple through deliberate concealment was not a mythological idea. It was a practice. It was planned and executed by real people with genuine intent. Who those people were, and how far in advance they prepared, is a question that archaeology has not yet answered. A second temple was eventually built on the same site, constructed after the Babylonian exile, completed around 516 BC, and later dramatically expanded by Herod the Great, beginning around 20 BC. The Herodian temple was, by most accounts, even more magnificent than its predecessor. Roman-era writers describe it in terms of almost disbelieving awe, its white stone blazing in the Palestinian sun, its gates gleaming, its courts filled with pilgrims from across the known world. This temple, too, was destroyed by Roman forces under the general Titus in 70 AD, an event recorded in painful detail by the Jewish historian Josephus, who was present. The Romans, like the Babylonians before them, removed what they could carry. The Arch of Titus in Rome still bears a relief carving of Roman soldiers carrying the temple's great menorah through the streets of the city in triumph. But certain objects, according to traditions that developed in both Jewish and early Christian communities in the years following the destruction, were not captured. They were moved beforehand, concealed by priests who understood what was coming and acted accordingly. The bronze doors are among the objects that appear in these traditions, not universally, not in every source, but consistently enough across independent accounts to have sustained a serious inquiry. Where were they taken? Here is where the trail, already faint, begins to divide into threads that lead in very different directions. One tradition, preserved in rabbinic literature, places certain temple treasures beneath the Temple Mount itself, concealed in chambers cut into the bedrock in the period immediately before the Roman siege. This is not an outlandish claim. Archaeological investigations in the broader region have documented the existence of extensive tunnel systems beneath Jerusalem's Old City, some of ancient origin, others from the medieval period. Access to the areas most likely to contain evidence directly beneath the Temple Mount has been, for reasons that are themselves historically complex, extremely limited. A second tradition, which gained particular momentum during the medieval period, traces certain temple objects, including the Ark of the Covenant and, in some versions of the account, the Great Doors, to Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains to this day that the Ark resides in a chapel in the city of Aksum, guarded by a single monk whose sole responsibility is its protection. Independent verification of this claim has never been permitted. A third current of speculation, associated primarily with the traditions and internal histories of Freemasonry, suggests that the Knights Templar, the medieval military order that established their headquarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem following the First Crusade in 1099, conducted excavations beneath the mount during their nearly 2 centuries of residence there, and that what they found fundamentally shaped both the order's theology and its eventual suppression. What they may have found, if anything, is unknown. The Templars were dissolved in the early 14th century under circumstances that remain contested by historians. Their archives, to the extent that they survive, have never been fully made available for independent scholarly examination. These are not equivalent claims. They come from traditions of very different evidentiary weight, and they point in genuinely different directions. But they share something worth noting: the consistent assumption, across cultures and centuries and radically different interpretive frameworks, that something from the Temple of Solomon survived, that it was preserved deliberately, and that it has not yet been found. The Temple Mount today is one of the most politically and religiously sensitive pieces of land on Earth. It sits at the intersection of competing claims that have proven, across decades of negotiation, essentially irresolvable. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque stand on its surface. Access to the mount is managed under arrangements of extraordinary delicacy. Systematic archaeological excavation of the kind that would be required to investigate the subterranean claims is not, under present circumstances, remotely possible. This means that the questions surrounding the bronze doors, where they went, whether they survived, whether they were sealed away in a location that remains intact, cannot currently be addressed through the tools that archaeology would normally bring to bear on them. And so they remain open questions, literally in a sense, unresolved, waiting. There are scholars who have spent careers on the margins of this problem, not the doors specifically, but the broader question of what the ancient temple complex contained, what was removed before each destruction, and where those objects might be now. Their work is careful, cross-referential, and necessarily incomplete. The evidence is fragmentary. The political context of the region makes field investigation extraordinarily difficult. And the traditions themselves, however internally consistent, cannot serve as proof of anything in the conventional archaeological sense. But here is what remains, stripped of tradition and speculation, as simple historical fact. A temple stood. It contained objects of extraordinary significance to the civilization that built it. That temple was destroyed at least twice. Some of what it contained was taken by conquerors whose own records confirm the removals. Some of what it contained was, by the account of sources that have proven reliable in other respects, deliberately hidden by those who understood the destruction was coming. The bronze doors were part of that temple. Their fate after 587 BC is not definitively documented. Their fate after 70 AD is not definitively documented. They have not been recovered. They have not been identified in any collection, public or private. They have not appeared in any excavation. They are simply gone. Whether they were melted down by soldiers who saw only the value of the metal, whether they were buried beneath the stones of a city that has been built and rebuilt and built again across 3,000 years, whether they rest in a subterranean chamber that no modern eye has entered, whether they were carried across sea and desert to a location that has kept their secret for 2 millennia, no one knows. And perhaps that is the truest thing that can be said about them. Not that they were magnificent, though they were. Not that their loss diminished something irreplaceable, though it did. But that they represent a category of mystery that history produces only rarely. An absence so well documented that the absence itself becomes a kind of presence. The doors are gone. The record of their going is incomplete. And somewhere in the gap between those two facts, the questions that have occupied scholars, theologians, treasure hunters, and quiet late-night researchers for centuries continue to breathe. What stood at the threshold of the most sacred space in the ancient world? And is it possible, just possible, that somewhere, sealed away from the light for reasons we no longer fully understand, it still stands? Absence, it turns out, can be as powerful as presence. The bronze doors of Solomon's temple have never been found, and yet their absence has shaped inquiry, fueled tradition, and quietly organized the curiosity of serious researchers for more than 2,000 years. There is something in the human mind that resists the idea of a complete disappearance, that insists, against all practical evidence, that something so deliberately made and so carefully described could not simply cease to exist. That instinct is not always wrong. Because at roughly 2,000 miles southwest of Jerusalem, rising from a limestone plateau above the western bank of the Nile, stands a structure that has generated the same quality of question for an even longer period of time. A structure so massive, so precisely constructed, and so thoroughly investigated, and yet so fundamentally unexplained, that every answer it has yielded has seemed only to deepen the questions that surround it. The Great Pyramid of Giza. It needs no elaborate introduction. It is the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one still standing. It was the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. Its base covers 13 acres. Its original height of approximately 480 feet was achieved through the placement of an estimated 2.5 million stone blocks, the largest weighing more than 80 tons, fitted together with a precision that modern engineers continue to study with genuine respect. It was built, according to the mainstream archaeological consensus, as the tomb of the pharaoh Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, somewhere around 2560 BC. This is the established position. It is supported by a substantial body of evidence, inscriptions, administrative records, archaeological context, and the logical continuity of a pyramid-building tradition that developed visibly across several generations of Egyptian rulers. And yet, the Great Pyramid continues, persistently and stubbornly, to resist complete explanation. Not because the mainstream account is wrong, necessarily, but because the structure contains elements, architectural, geometric, and now increasingly physical, that the mainstream account has not yet fully absorbed. Among those elements are the doors. The interior of the Great Pyramid is, by any measure, a remarkable space. From the original entrance on the northern face, positioned at a height of approximately 55 feet above the base, a descending passage cuts downward through the bedrock at a precise angle of 26 degrees, leading to an unfinished chamber deep beneath the pyramid's foundation. A second passage, the ascending corridor, branches upward from the descending one and leads eventually to the structure's two principal interior chambers, the so-called Queen's Chamber, positioned at the pyramid's geometric center, and the Grand Gallery, an extraordinary corbelled passage nearly 30 feet high that opens into the King's Chamber, where a lidless granite sarcophagus sits in the darkness. This much has been known in its broad outline since antiquity. Arab scholars explored and documented the accessible passages during the medieval period. European explorers and early archaeologists mapped them in the 18th and 19th centuries. The chambers have been measured, photographed, and analyzed from almost every conceivable angle. But in 1993, a robotic explorer named Upuaut II, designed by German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink, was sent into a narrow shaft leading from the Queen's Chamber that had been known since the 19th century but never fully investigated. The shaft, approximately 8 inches square, extended horizontally from the chamber's south wall before angling upward at a steep incline. It was too small for a human body. It had been assumed, without much examination, to be a ventilation channel. Upuaut II traveled 65 meters up the shaft before its camera revealed something that stopped the investigation in its tracks. A small limestone door. It was fitted with 2 copper fittings, handles or hinges, their precise function unclear, and sealed flush against the shaft walls with a precision that left no obvious gap. The door had not been seen by any human eye in roughly 4,500 years. It sat at the end of a passage too small for any person to reach, in a pyramid that had been under continuous investigation for centuries, utterly undisturbed. The discovery generated considerable excitement, and eventually considerable frustration. Political and administrative complications delayed further investigation for nearly a decade. When a second robot, this one equipped with a small drill, was finally sent up the shaft in 2002, it bored a tiny hole through the limestone door and inserted a miniature camera. Behind the first door was a small space, and at the back of that space was another door. What lay beyond the second door has not been determined. The equipment available at the time could not reach or penetrate it. The investigation stalled again, entangled in the same web of jurisdictional, political, and logistical complications that has characterized Great Pyramid research for decades. As of the most recent publicly available information, those 2 doors, the first breached by a drill hole no wider than a finger, the second entirely intact, remain in place. Unexamined, sealed. A parallel shaft on the north side of the Queen's Chamber was investigated around the same time, and found to contain a similar door, also fitted with copper fittings, also sealed. Its condition and what lies beyond it remain equally undetermined. 4 doors, in total, blocking 4 shafts that lead to destinations that have not yet been mapped. The question of what these doors are guarding, or simply covering, has produced a wide spectrum of responses from the research community. The conservative position holds that the shafts are indeed ventilation channels, or perhaps symbolic passages designed to allow the pharaoh's soul to navigate toward specific stars in the Egyptian celestial tradition. The doors, on this reading, are simply construction features, placed at the shaft terminations as a matter of architectural finish, with no chamber or significant space beyond them. The copper fittings may have served a ritual rather than a functional purpose. This is a reasonable position. It is consistent with what is known of Old Kingdom funerary architecture and cosmological belief. It does not require the existence of anything hidden, but it does not fully account for the second door. If the first door were a terminal architectural feature, a wall, essentially, there would be no reason for a second one. The presence of a gap between them and a second sealed surface beyond that gap implies either an intermediate space of some purpose or a construction sequence whose logic has not been clearly articulated. Researchers who have examined the evidence more closely point to another consideration. The copper fittings on the doors are not decorative in any obvious sense. Copper was a valuable material in ancient Egypt, not squandered on elements that served no purpose. The fittings appear designed to allow the doors to be operated, opened and closed, from one side, which raises a question that the ventilation theory does not comfortably address. Why would a ventilation channel need a door that could be opened and closed? And from which side? This is the point at which the more speculative currents of inquiry begin to surface, and where the history of Great Pyramid research intersects with a tradition of alternative theory that is, depending on one's perspective, either a productive challenge to orthodoxy or a persistent distraction from it. The idea that the Great Pyramid conceals undiscovered chambers is not new. It predates modern archaeology by centuries. Arab medieval scholars wrote of hidden rooms containing ancient knowledge. Renaissance-era travelers reported traditions of sealed spaces beneath the structure. Early modern explorers came to the plateau with the explicit hope of finding rooms that conventional maps did not show. Most of these expeditions found nothing beyond what was already known, but the tools available to those explorers were limited: hammers, chisels, and human intuition. The tools available today are considerably more sophisticated. In 2017, a multinational scientific project called Scan Pyramids, using muon tomography, a technique that tracks subatomic particles as they pass through dense material, announced a significant finding. A large void had been detected within the Great Pyramid structure, above the Grand Gallery, in a location where no passage or chamber had previously been documented. The void is substantial, at least 100 feet long, its full dimensions still being refined, and it does not correspond to any known architectural feature of the building. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities confirmed the finding. The team was cautious in its interpretation. A void, they noted, could be a construction gap, a stress-relieving chamber, or an architectural element with no significant contents. But it could also be something else. No direct investigation of this void has been completed. Access remains technically and politically complex. The research continues. Taken together, the sealed shaft doors, the copper fittings, the undetermined second door, the large unidentified void, the picture that emerges is of a structure that has not yet finished yielding its information. A building that has been studied continuously for centuries and that continues, with a quality that can only be called patience, to hold something back. What that something might be has attracted theories of every conceivable variety. Most of them are not worth dwelling on at length, but a small number of serious researchers, people with genuine credentials and careful methodologies, have raised questions that deserve acknowledgement. Among them is the question of the pyramid's relationship to the Nile and to the broader Giza plateau. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s and early 2000s detected what appeared to be tunnel systems and cavities beneath the plateau's surface. Some apparently natural, others less clearly so. A series of shafts and passages in the area around the Sphinx have been documented, investigated partially, and then closed to further research under circumstances that some scholars have found difficult to understand. The subterranean geography of Giza is, in other words, more complex than the surface monuments alone suggest. And the relationship between what lies above ground and what may lie beneath it has not been fully mapped. There is an ancient tradition, preserved in Greek and Roman sources, in medieval Arab texts, and in certain strands of Hermetic philosophy that drew heavily on Egyptian sources, that beneath the Giza plateau lies a library. Not a library in the conventional sense, but a repository of knowledge accumulated before what these traditions describe as a great catastrophe. A collection of records, instruments, and texts that encoded the understanding of a civilization that knew it was about to be lost. This tradition is known, in its most familiar modern form, through references to a place called the Hall of Records. It appears in a variety of ancient sources. It was described with particular vividness by the sleeping prophet Edgar Cayce in the early 20th century, who placed it specifically beneath the right paw of the Sphinx. Systematic excavation in that area has not confirmed its presence, though the full extent of what lies beneath has not been conclusively mapped. This is not evidence of anything. But the tradition itself, its persistence across such different cultural and historical contexts, is a phenomenon that invites a question. Where does a tradition this consistent come from, if not from some original source? The Great Pyramid stands today as it has for 4,500 years, patient, massive, and fundamentally opaque. Its sealed doors remain sealed, its undiscovered void remains undiscovered. The questions that gather around it are not smaller than they were a century ago. In many respects, as the tools of investigation have grown more precise, the questions have become more sharply defined, and that, perhaps, is the most honest summary of where things stand. We know more about the Great Pyramid than any generation before us has known. We have mapped its passages with lasers, scanned its interior with particle physics, and analyzed its stones with instruments that would have seemed like magic to its builders. And we still do not know what is behind the second door. That gap, between the extraordinary reach of modern science and the simple, sealed fact of a limestone door at the end of a passage too narrow for any human body, is perhaps the truest measure of how much still waits to be understood. The pyramid does not offer its secrets on demand. It never has. It simply stands and waits, and holds whatever it holds in a darkness that no light has reached in 4,500 years. What is behind that door? And is the fact that we still cannot answer that question a failure of our methods, or a reflection of just how carefully something was meant to stay hidden? The pyramid is not alone in its silence. It stands at the center of a plateau that has been continuously inhabited, studied, and mythologized for longer than almost any other place on Earth. And the Great Pyramid, for all its overwhelming scale and complexity, is not the only structure on that plateau that guards something unexplained. It is not even the only structure within walking distance that contains a sealed door behind which something unknown may rest. Because directly beneath the causeway that connects the Great Pyramid to the valley below, beneath the surface of the plateau itself, cut into the living bedrock at a depth that took centuries to rediscover, there is a shaft. It does not announce itself. There is no monument above it, no inscription at its entrance, no dramatic architectural frame to signal its significance. From the surface, it appears as little more than a vertical opening in the stone, the kind of feature that the Giza plateau contains in modest abundance, most of them well documented, most of them unremarkable. This one is different. The structure now known as the Osiris shaft descends through 3 distinct levels of bedrock, each separated from the next by a vertical drop that grows more difficult to navigate the deeper one goes. The first level is modest, a rectangular chamber carved from the limestone, its walls rough and unadorned, its purpose unclear. The second level is more complex, containing several side chambers that appear to have served as subsidiary burial spaces at some point in the structure's long history. Artifacts recovered from this level during various investigations, pottery fragments, shabtis, a sarcophagus lid, have been dated to a range of periods, suggesting the shaft was used, modified, and perhaps repurposed across a considerable span of time. But it is the third level that stops every serious investigator in their tracks. To reach it, one must descend through a vertical shaft that fills at its base with groundwater. The water table beneath the Giza plateau fluctuates, but it is rarely absent from this deepest chamber entirely. Investigators working at this level have done so in water that reached their waists, their chests, in some cases higher, navigating by lamp and instinct through a darkness that the surrounding stone seems almost to generate rather than merely contain. What they found at the bottom has generated more sustained, serious inquiry than almost anything else discovered on the plateau in the last century. A large rectangular chamber, carved from the bedrock with a precision that stands in striking contrast to the rougher work of the levels above. At its center, on a raised island of stone surrounded by the encroaching water, sits a massive stone sarcophagus, lidless, empty, and carved from a single block of dark granite. Around the central island, 4 rectangular pillars support the chamber's ceiling. The walls are undecorated. There are no inscriptions. There is no obvious indication of when this space was created, by whom, or for what specific purpose. And at one end of the chamber there is a door, or rather, what was a door. A sealed passage cut into the rock face and closed with a blocking stone, whose placement and finish suggest it was not meant to be easily removed. Behind it, as far as current investigation has been able to determine, lies a passage or chamber that has not been entered in an indeterminate period of time. How long? That is one of the questions for which there is, as yet, no clean answer. The Osiris shaft entered the modern archaeological record in a fragmented and inconsistent way. It was known, in a general sense, to Egyptian antiquities authorities and to researchers working on the plateau. It appears in passing references in older Egyptological literature. But it was not subject to systematic investigation until a series of expeditions conducted in the late 1990s. Most notably under the direction of Egyptologist Zahi Hawass, brought the shaft's full depth and complexity to wider attention. Hawass and his team documented the 3-level structure, cataloged what could be reached, and brought the sarcophagus on the 3rd level to broader scholarly awareness. Their findings were significant, but they also made clear that the investigation was incomplete, that the sealed passage at the chamber's end represented an unknown that the available resources and conditions had not permitted them to address. That passage remained sealed. The conventional archaeological interpretation of the Osiris shaft places its construction within the New Kingdom period of ancient Egyptian history, roughly 1550 to 1070 BC, with some elements possibly dating to the late period, around 664 to 332 BC. On this reading, the shaft is a symbolic tomb, constructed to evoke the mythological burial place of Osiris, the god of the dead, resurrection, and the afterlife, rather than an actual royal burial. The empty sarcophagus, the subterranean water, the island at the chamber's center, all of these elements map onto the Osirian mythology with a consistency that the mainstream interpretation finds compelling. This is a coherent position. It is grounded in genuine knowledge of Egyptian religious practice and iconographic tradition. The Egyptians built symbolic tombs and cenotaphs, burial monuments not intended for actual interment, with some regularity, particularly for sacred figures who were understood to be present in multiple places simultaneously. But the conventional interpretation leaves certain things unaddressed. The precision of the 3rd-level chamber's construction is difficult to reconcile with a New Kingdom date. The cutting technique, The geometric regularity of the space and the quality of the granite sarcophagus are more consistent with the standard of work associated with the Old Kingdom, the period of the pyramid builders, than with the later dynasties to which the shaft is officially assigned. This observation has been made by more than one researcher with relevant expertise, and it has not been satisfactorily explained within the conventional framework. There is also the matter of the shaft's location. It sits directly beneath the causeway of the Great Pyramid, the ceremonial road that connected Khufu's mortuary temple to the valley below. This placement is not incidental. In ancient Egyptian architectural tradition, spatial relationships carried meaning. The positioning of a significant subterranean structure directly beneath a major ceremonial axis is not the kind of thing that happened by accident or convenience. What does it mean that this shaft, with its Osirian iconography, its sealed passage, its Old Kingdom construction quality, sits precisely where it does? Was it here before the causeway was built above it? Was the causeway placed deliberately in relationship to the shaft? Or is the connection coincidental, a reading of pattern where none was intended? These are questions that the available evidence does not yet allow to be answered with confidence. And then there is the older tradition. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC after traveling to Egypt and consulting with local priests and scholars, describes what he was told about the Great Pyramid's construction and the landscape surrounding it. In one frequently discussed passage, he mentions an underground chamber, or chambers, associated with the pyramid complex, surrounded by water, said to contain the tomb of the man who built it. Herodotus was not a flawless reporter. He recorded what he was told, filtered through translation and the particular interests of his informants. His account of Egypt contains passages that have been confirmed by subsequent archaeology, and passages that remain unverified, but the specificity of his description, underground, water, tomb, maps onto the third level of the Osiris shaft with an uncomfortability that researchers have found difficult to simply set aside. Was Herodotus describing a tradition that pointed to this specific location? Was the shaft he gestures toward the Osiris shaft something else, or a conflation of multiple real features? No one can say with certainty, but the alignment is there, and it has been noticed. The shaft's name, the Osiris shaft, was not assigned by ancient Egyptians. It is a modern designation, reflecting the structure's apparent Osirian symbolism. But the name has a history of its own, one that connects the site to a much older layer of tradition. Classical writers, Greek, Roman, and later Arab, preserved accounts of a sacred site at Giza associated specifically with Osiris, a place of descent, of water, of concealment. A location understood, in the religious geography of the ancient world, to mark the point where the boundary between the living and the dead was thinnest. These accounts vary in their details and in the reliability of their sources, but they recur across different cultures and different centuries, with a consistency that suggests they derive from a common original, some actual feature of the plateau that impressed itself on the imagination of those who encountered it. Is the Osiris shaft that feature? Or is it a reflection of it? A later construction built to evoke and inhabit a tradition whose original referent was something older and deeper. Here, the evidence gives out, and the more speculative currents of inquiry take over. There are researchers, not fringe writers, but credentialed scholars working at the edge of what the evidence permits, who have proposed that the Giza Plateau's subterranean geography is considerably more extensive than current maps reflect, that the shafts and chambers documented over the past 2 centuries represent only the portions of a larger network that happen to have been exposed or accessed, that the relationship between the Osiris shaft, the passages beneath the Sphinx enclosure, and the sealed shafts inside the Great Pyramid itself may be structural rather than coincidental, different elements of an integrated underground complex whose full extent has not been mapped. This hypothesis is not provable with available data. It is also not disprovable. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have produced results that are consistent with the existence of additional subterranean features in several areas of the plateau. Those surveys have also produced ambiguous readings that resist clean interpretation. What lies behind the sealed passage at the third level of the Osiris shaft is unknown. It may be a short corridor terminating in blank rock. It may be another chamber. It may connect to something larger. The water that fills the lower shaft has made systematic investigation extraordinarily difficult. Not impossible, but difficult enough that it has not been completed. And the political and logistical context of Giza research has not, historically, made such investigations easy to conduct or to report on fully. There is one more thing worth noting, something small but persistent. Among the researchers who have worked at the deepest level of the Osiris shaft, several have independently remarked on a quality of the space that is difficult to articulate in purely technical language. Not a supernatural impression, not a mystical experience, but something more basic, a sense produced by the combination of the chamber's precise geometry, the surrounding water, the total darkness, and the sealed passage at the far wall. That one is in a place that was designed to produce exactly this feeling, that the architecture is not merely functional, but intentional in its effect. That someone built this space to communicate something about death, about passage, about what lies beyond a threshold, and that the sealed door is not incidental to that communication, but central to it. Whether that threshold was meant to be crossed or only contemplated is a question the shaft does not answer. The water rises and falls with the seasons. The sarcophagus sits in its island of stone, empty in the dark. The sealed passage waits at the chamber's end, as it has waited for however many centuries or millennia separate us from whoever placed that blocking stone in position and turned away. What did they seal in? What did they seal out? And is it possible that the answer to both questions is the same thing? That what lies behind that door is not an object, or a text, or a treasure in any conventional sense, but something more fundamental? Something that the people who built this place understood and encoded in stone and water and darkness, and chose very deliberately not to leave accessible. The Osiris shaft sits beneath the plateau, beneath the causeway, beneath the shadow of the Great Pyramid that has watched over this ground for 4,500 years. It has been found. It has been entered partially. It has been named and mapped and debated. And still, at its deepest point, it holds something back. What waits behind that sealed door in the dark and the water? We have not yet found a way to ask the question that would produce an answer. There is a pattern emerging. Across the sites we have visited, the vaults beneath an Indian temple, the burial mound of a Chinese emperor, the sacred precinct of an ancient Palestinian city, the sealed shafts inside and beneath the greatest pyramid on earth, the same fundamental dynamic appears again and again. A space is created with extraordinary intentionality. Something is placed within it, or the space itself carries meaning. And then a door is closed, a passage is sealed. A threshold is established that the builders clearly intended to be permanent. In each case, the sealing was a choice, a deliberate act. And in each case, what drove that choice? Fear, reverence, strategic concealment, or something we do not yet have adequate language to describe, remains only partially understood. But all of the places we have explored so far share one characteristic. They exist at or near the surface of the earth. Their mysteries are vertical only in the sense that they descend a certain distance into bedrock or burial mound before terminating in a sealed space that imagination and instrument can reach, at least partially, from above. What happens when the mystery goes deeper? not metaphorically, literally. What happens when an entire civilization, its streets, its homes, its places of worship, its systems of life support, is built not on the surface of the earth, but inside it? In the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, beneath a landscape of extraordinary volcanic strangeness, where wind and water have sculpted the soft, tough stone into formations that look like nothing so much as the surface of another planet, there exists a city that descends 18 stories beneath the ground. It is called Derinkuyu. And somewhere within it, behind a gate that the official maps do not fully account for, something waits in a darkness that makes the darkness of the Osiris shaft seem almost familiar by comparison. To understand what Derinkuyu is, one must first understand what it is not. It is not a cave system. It is not a series of natural formations that humans adapted for shelter. It is not a simple network of tunnels dug in haste by people fleeing a temporary threat. It is a city, engineered, organized, and deliberately constructed to support thousands of human beings in sustained underground habitation. It has ventilation shafts, more than 50 of them, precisely positioned to circulate fresh air through all 18 levels. It has wells. It has food storage rooms, carefully identified by the residues their walls still carry. It has wine and oil presses, their stone mechanisms intact. It has stables with channels carved into the floors for drainage. It has communal spaces, rooms large enough to gather in, with benches cut from the living rock along their walls. It has a church, carved from the stone at one of its deeper levels, cross-shaped in plan, its nave and aisles clearly identifiable, its purpose unmistakable. And it has a school, a room identified by early investigators by the presence of small carved niches in its walls, spaces consistent with the storage of learning materials, and by its position within the complex, separated from residential and utilitarian areas in a way that suggests a designated function. A city, in other words, not in any reduced or metaphorical sense. A fully realized human community, transposed from the surface of the earth into its interior, with every system required for life reproduced in stone. How large is it? The portions open to visitors today represent, by most estimates, only a fraction of the total structure. The accessible areas cover approximately 40 acres and include 8 of the 18 documented levels. The deeper levels, those below the 8th, are not open to the public, and access to them is controlled by Turkish archaeological authorities. Some areas within those lower levels have been investigated by specialists. Others have not. The total population Derinkuyu could have supported at full capacity has been estimated at somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 people, a figure that, when one is standing in its corridors, seems not merely plausible but somehow, in the quality of its engineering, conservative. The city's most famous defensive feature is its rolling stone doors. At key points throughout the complex, at level transitions, at corridor junctions, at the entrances to critical areas, massive circular stone discs, some weighing several tons, were positioned in tracks carved into the floor and ceiling. In the event of an incursion, these stones could be rolled into position from the inside, sealing a passage completely. Crucially, the locking mechanism was designed to be operated only from the interior side. An army pressing in from outside could not open a rolled door. The people inside were sealed in, but sealed in on their own terms, in a space large enough to sustain them indefinitely. This is a remarkable piece of engineering. It is also a remarkable psychological artifact. It tells us something about the people who built Derinkuyu that no amount of pottery analysis or carbon dating can fully convey. They were building for a worst case. They were imagining, in concrete and deliberate detail, a scenario in which the surface world had become so dangerous that tens of thousands of people would need to disappear beneath it, completely for an extended period, and survive. Who were those people? When did they build this city? These are questions that Derinkuyu research has not answered with the completeness one might hope for. The mainstream archaeological position attributes Derinkuyu's construction and primary use to the early Christian communities of Cappadocia, beginning roughly in the Byzantine period, approximately the 7th and 8th centuries AD, when Arab raids made the surface of the region genuinely dangerous and underground refuge a practical necessity. This attribution is supported by the presence of the Christian church at the deeper levels, by certain stylistic features of the carving, and by the general historical context of the period. But it is complicated by several things that do not fit neatly into that timeline. The Hittites, one of the great powers of the ancient Near East, whose empire centered in Anatolia and whose capital was located not far from Cappadocia, are documented in texts dating to around 1400 BC as having used underground structures in the region for storage and shelter. The Phrygians, who succeeded the Hittites in the area, left their own marks on the Cappadocian landscape in ways that suggest familiarity with its underground potential. More significantly, certain features of Derinkuyu's construction, particularly in its deepest levels, exhibit a quality and scale of engineering that some researchers have found difficult to reconcile with a medieval Byzantine attribution. The ventilation system in particular has attracted attention. It is not merely functional. It is sophisticated in a way that implies careful planning, precise understanding of air circulation principles, and a level of organizational capacity that would have been, on the Byzantine frontier, extraordinary. Who designed it? Who possessed the knowledge to plan and execute a ventilation network of this complexity at this scale? The question does not have a clean answer, and it is not the only question that Derinkuyu's deeper levels raise. In 2013, construction work in the nearby town of Nevşehir, the modern city built above and around the broader Cappadocian underground complex, revealed the entrance to a previously undocumented underground structure of considerable size. Subsequent investigation suggested it might be larger than Derinkuyu itself. The discovery generated significant excitement in the archaeological community, followed by the careful, measured language that serious researchers use when confronted with something they cannot yet fully assess. That investigation is ongoing. Its findings, as they emerge, continue to expand the picture of what lies beneath Cappadocia's surface. But the feature of Derinkuyu that most directly concerns us, the gate, the sealed passage, the forbidden threshold, is not in Nevşehir. It is in the deeper levels of Derinkuyu itself. At the lowest accessible levels of the complex, below the areas routinely shown to visitors, in the regions where access requires authorization and equipment, there are passages that connect Derinkuyu to other underground cities in the region. Tunnels, in some cases extending for miles, linking one subterranean community to another in a network whose full extent has not been mapped. The tunnel connecting Derinkuyu to the nearby underground city of Kaymakli, for example, is approximately 5 miles long, a subterranean corridor wide enough for 2 people to pass, running through the bedrock beneath the Cappadocian plain. These connecting tunnels are remarkable in their own right. They imply a level of inter-community coordination, a shared understanding of purpose, a collective investment in infrastructure that suggests something more organized than a series of independent local responses to surface danger. Someone, at some point, made a decision to connect these cities, to create a network, not just a refuge. But within Derinkuyu, below the documented levels, there is a passage, or series of passages, that does not connect to the known network. It does not lead toward Kaymakli or any other identified underground settlement. It descends, and at some point in its descent it is blocked. The nature of this blockage has been described differently by different sources, which is itself a notable fact. In most archaeological sites, the nature of a sealed passage is not a matter of significant interpretive dispute. A blocked corridor is a blocked corridor, and the manner of its blocking is usually straightforward to document. At Derinkuyu, the accounts of what exactly seals the deepest passage are inconsistent in ways that suggest either limited and varying access to the relevant area or something about the blockage itself that resists easy categorization. What is consistent across accounts is this: the passage exists, it descends below the documented levels, and it is not accessible. Whether it is sealed by a deliberate door or gate, by a collapse of the tunnel structure, by accumulated debris, or by some combination of these factors has not been publicly established with clarity. This ambiguity is frustrating. It is also, in its own way, informative. The Turkish government and its archaeological authorities have been, over the decades, selective in what information about Derinkuyu's deepest reaches has been made publicly available. This is not an accusation. It is a straightforward observation about the state of the public record. The reasons for this selectivity could be entirely mundane: structural safety concerns, ongoing investigation, administrative caution about sites that attract both serious researchers and less scrupulous visitors. But the selectivity itself has created a vacuum that speculation has rushed to fill. And some of that speculation, whatever its ultimate merit, raises questions that deserve at minimum to be acknowledged. Among the more persistent alternative theories surrounding Derinkuyu is the suggestion that the city, or at least its deepest levels, predates its conventional attribution by a significant margin. Not centuries, but millennia. Proponents of this view point to the engineering quality of the lower levels, the scale of the ventilation system, and certain geometric features of the deeper chambers that appear, to some observers, more consistent with a pre-Hittite or even pre-Bronze Age construction tradition than with the Byzantine period. This is a minority view. It is not supported by the mainstream archaeological consensus, which has good reasons, stratigraphic, artifactual, and textual, for its conventional dating. But the minority view is not entirely without basis. The problem of distinguishing original construction from later modification and expansion in a site like Derinkuyu is genuinely complex. Communities that used the underground city over centuries would have added to it, altered it, repaired it. Identifying the original core of the structure, the first construction phase, and dating it accurately is a methodological challenge that has not been fully resolved. If the deepest levels are older than currently acknowledged, not dramatically older perhaps, but older, then the sealed passage at their base represents a threshold of correspondingly greater antiquity, and the question of what it contains shifts accordingly. There is another dimension to the Derinkuyu mystery that is less often discussed but arguably more unsettling than the question of dating. The city was abandoned. Not destroyed, not conquered, as far as the archaeological record shows. Not buried by volcanic eruption or flooded or collapsed. It was simply left. Its inhabitants departed, taking with them whatever was portable, and the city remained empty beneath the Cappadocian plain for centuries before its rediscovery. Why? The conventional explanation ties the abandonment to the stabilization of the region's political situation. When the surface became safe again, people returned to it, preferring the sun and open air of the plateau to the compressed darkness of the underground city. This is plausible. It is, on its face, the most logical explanation, but it does not account for a detail that several investigators have noted: the manner in which certain areas of Derinkuyu appear to have been sealed before abandonment. Not just the rolling stone doors, which were a standing defensive feature of the complex, but other passages, other openings, blocked in ways that suggest deliberate permanent closure rather than temporary defense. Why would a community abandoning its underground city, leaving voluntarily in apparent safety, take the time to permanently seal certain passages before going? What were they closing off? What were they ensuring would not be opened after they left? These questions do not have documented answers. They may have simple answers that the available evidence has not yet revealed, but they linger. They have the quality of questions that point towards something real, not necessarily dramatic or exotic, but real, something that the people who lived in Derinkuyu understood about their city, and that we, approaching it from outside and above and millennia later, have not yet grasped. Stand, for a moment, in the imagination, at the threshold of that sealed passage. Below the 8th level, below the church and the school and the stables and the wine presses, below the rolling stone doors and the ventilation shafts and the wells, in a darkness that is total, and a silence that carries the particular quality of enclosed stone, a silence that absorbs sound rather than reflecting it. The air is cool, the walls are close, the ceiling is low enough in places to require bending. The carved stone surface has the quality of something shaped by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Hands guided by a tradition of underground construction that had been refined over a very long time. And ahead, the passage ends, or appears to end, or is made to end by something that was placed here with intention. What is on the other side? The mundane answer, that it is simply more tunnel, collapsing into rubble, leading nowhere significant, is possible. It is perhaps even probable. But Derinkuyu has not, historically, rewarded the assumption of the mundane. Every time a new section of the complex has been opened, every time a new connecting tunnel has been traced, every time the ground beneath a Cappadocian town has been opened by construction and revealed something unexpected beneath it, the picture has grown larger and more complex. The city beneath the city, the network beneath the landscape, the passage beneath the passage. And at the bottom of all of it, a gate that the people who built this extraordinary place chose, at some point, to seal. They knew what was behind it, they made a decision about it, and then they left. We are still here, on the other side of that decision, with our instruments and our questions and our incomplete maps. What did they know that we do not? What is it that an entire civilization, sophisticated enough to build an 18-story underground city with a functioning ventilation system and a capacity for 50,000 people, looked at and decided to close away from the world forever? The sealed gate at the base of Derinkuyu does not offer an answer. It offers only itself. A threshold, a boundary, a decision made in stone by hands that are long gone. And the darkness beyond it continues, patient and absolute, to keep whatever it was given to keep. Derinkuyu leaves a particular impression. It is not the scale, exactly, though the scale is genuinely staggering. It is not the engineering, though the engineering deserves every word of admiration it has received. It is something subtler, the quality of the intentionality. The sense, moving through those carved corridors, that every decision made in the construction of that city was made by people who knew precisely what they were doing and why. People who possessed, in whatever form their knowledge took, a mastery of the underground that modern investigators are still working to fully understand. That mastery was not unique to Cappadocia. Across the ancient world, in cultures with no documented contact with one another, the same capacity appears: the ability to work stone at depth, to organize subterranean space with architectural sophistication, to create underground environments that function, persist, and in some cases conceal things that have not yet been found. China, as we have already seen with the tomb of its first emperor, has its own relationship with this tradition. But the burial complex at Xi'an, extraordinary as it is, was built for a specific person, at a specific moment in history, by a workforce whose existence is documented. What happens when an underground complex of comparable scale appears with no documentation at all? No records, no inscriptions, no historical memory of its construction, no account, in any source from any period, of the labor that must have been required to create it. What happens when something that should be impossible, by any conventional reckoning of what ancient people could achieve without recorded organization, without documented tools, without any trace in the historical record, is simply, undeniably, there? In 1992, in Zhejiang province in eastern China, a farmer named Wu Anai decided to drain a pond near the village of Xian Beikun. The pond had always been there. Local people fished in it. Children swam in its shallows. No one thought of it as anything other than what it appeared to be: a modest body of water in a landscape of modest bodies of water, unremarkable in every respect. When the water level dropped, Wu Anai found a cave entrance. He and several neighbors continued pumping. The water dropped further. More cave entrances appeared. They kept pumping. By the time the water was gone, 5 cave entrances had been revealed, each one leading into a vast underground chamber carved from the siltstone bedrock of the Zhejiang Plain. Over the following years, additional investigations would bring the total number of confirmed caves to 24. Some estimates, based on geological surveys of the broader area, suggest there may be as many as 36. The Longyou Caves. To step inside one of the principal chambers is to experience a particular quality of disorientation, the feeling that the scale of what surrounds you cannot quite be reconciled with the evidence of how it was made. The caves are enormous. The largest covers an area of approximately 25,000 square feet, with ceilings that rise in places to nearly 30 feet. The total volume of rock removed to create the known caves is estimated at somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million cubic meters. This is not a natural formation. Every surface, floor, wall, ceiling, the pillars that support the roof, bears the marks of human tools. Parallel chisel marks, applied in consistent diagonal patterns, cover every carved surface with a regularity that is almost mechanical in its precision. The same pattern, maintained across every wall of every cave, across what must have been an enormous workforce operating over a considerable period of time. And yet there is no record of this workforce. There is no record of this project. In a civilization, ancient China, that kept administrative records with extraordinary diligence, that documented construction projects, military campaigns, agricultural outputs, and court proceedings across thousands of years of continuous written history, the Longyou Caves do not appear. Not once. Not in any document from any dynasty, not in local gazetteers, not in imperial records, not in the accounts of travelers who passed through Zhejiang over the centuries. Not anywhere. This absence is, in its own way, as striking as the caves themselves. Consider what it would have taken to excavate 1 million cubic meters of rock from beneath a populated region of China, using hand tools, without any mechanical assistance, and remove all of that material to the surface without leaving a trace in the documentary record. The workforce required would have numbered in the thousands, sustained over years or decades. The logistical operation, feeding those workers, organizing their shifts, disposing of the excavated stone, would have been substantial enough to require administrative oversight of some kind. Where did the excavated material go? This is a question that geologists and archaeologists have investigated and have not satisfactorily answered. The volume of stone removed from the caves should be visible somewhere in the surrounding landscape, as fills, as construction material, as something. It has not been identified. The stone is simply gone, as thoroughly as the records of the people who removed it. The mainstream archaeological position holds that the caves were most likely constructed during the Qin dynasty period, roughly 221 to 206 BC, or possibly during the earlier spring and autumn period, around 770 to 476 BC. This dating is based primarily on the style of the chisel marks and certain ceramic fragments found within the caves during initial investigation. It is a reasonable inference from limited evidence, offered with the appropriate academic caution. But the absence of any documentary record remains unexplained. The Qin dynasty was, as we have already discussed in the context of the first emperor's tomb, a period of obsessive administrative record-keeping. It is difficult to reconcile the organizational apparatus of Qin governance with a construction project of this scale that left no administrative trace whatsoever, unless the absence of records was itself intentional. This possibility, that the Longyou caves were constructed in deliberate secrecy, their existence known to a restricted group and withheld from the documentary record by design, has been raised by several researchers. It is not a fringe proposition. It follows logically from the evidence. The caves are real and enormous and clearly constructed. The records of their construction do not exist. Therefore, either the records were never created, which seems improbable given the scale, or they were destroyed or withheld. If the latter, then whoever ordered the destruction or suppression of those records was protecting something. And the question of what they were protecting opens onto the territory that most directly concerns us. Because within the Longyou caves, behind the overwhelming visual spectacle of those chiseled walls and soaring ceilings, there is a door. The internal geography of the caves is complex. The chambers connect to one another through carved passages, some wide and deliberate, others narrower and less finished in their appearance. The relationship between the caves, their spatial arrangement, their orientations relative to one another, and to external geographic features, has been studied by researchers who have noted patterns that suggest an organizing logic beyond simple pragmatic excavation. The caves are not random, they are arranged. The pillars within them are positioned with a consistency that implies planning rather than improvisation. The chambers relate to one another in ways that researchers have not yet fully decoded, but that clearly reflect deliberate intention. And within this arranged, intentional space, there is a passage that leads to a section of wall unlike the others. Unlike the uniformly chiseled surfaces of the main chambers, this section of wall appears to have been modified after the initial excavation, worked in a manner that suggests sealing rather than carving. The surface has been described by investigators who have examined it closely as having the quality of a closure, a deliberate filling or blocking of what was once an opening, executed with sufficient care to blend with the surrounding stone but distinguishable, under close examination, from the original carved surface. Behind it, or potentially behind it, is a space that the current surveys have not mapped. Ground-penetrating radar work conducted in and around the Longyou caves has produced results that the investigating teams have described with characteristic scientific caution as suggesting the possible presence of additional cavities beyond the currently documented chambers. These results are preliminary. They have not been confirmed by direct investigation. They may reflect natural geological features rather than constructed spaces, but they have not been ruled out. The sealed section of wall, if that is indeed what it is, sits at a point in the cave system where the spatial logic of the arrangement, extended in the direction the pattern implies, would place another chamber. Whether this spatial logic is meaningful or coincidental is a question that the available evidence cannot resolve. What would be in such a chamber if it exists? This is where the investigation reaches its natural limit, and speculation, handled carefully, becomes the only available tool. The caves themselves contain almost nothing. This is one of their most striking characteristics. For spaces of this scale and evident significance, they are remarkably empty. The ceramic fragments that provided the basis for the mainstream dating represent an extremely sparse assemblage. There are no inscriptions, no statuary, no evidence of the kind of sustained habitation that would leave organic residues, tool assemblages, or stratified deposits. The caves were not lived in, as far as the evidence shows. They were not used for storage, at least not in a way that left material traces. They were not quarries. The stone removed from them has not been found. They were not tombs. There are no burials. So, what were they? Some researchers have proposed that the caves served a military purpose, as barracks, as supply depots, as refuge spaces analogous in function to Derinkuyu. This is plausible in a general sense, but difficult to reconcile with the specific character of the spaces. Military installations tend to leave evidence of the activities they supported. The Longyou caves are clean in a way that military use rarely produces. Others have proposed that the caves were ceremonial, sacred spaces of some kind, used for rituals whose nature has not been preserved in any accessible record. The consistent diagonal patterning of the chisel marks, applied with a care that goes well beyond what structural necessity would require, is consistent with this interpretation. The marks may be decorative or symbolic, or both. In certain light and at certain angles, the patterned walls produce an almost textile quality, as if the stone has been woven rather than carved. A smaller number of researchers, working at the edge of what the evidence permits, have proposed something more fundamental, that the Longyou caves are not primarily functional at all, not military, not ceremonial, not practical in any conventional sense, but representational, that they encode, in their geometry and their arrangement and their carefully patterned surfaces, a body of knowledge or a system of meaning that was too important to commit to perishable materials and too sensitive to commit to the documentary record. A message, in other words, written in stone, at a scale that guaranteed its survival, in a language that has not yet been read. This is a speculative proposition. It cannot be evaluated with current evidence, but it has a quality that distinguishes it from mere imagination. It is the only interpretation that fully accounts for all of the cave's unusual characteristics simultaneously: the scale, the precision, the emptiness, the absence of records, the sealed passage, and the spatial logic of the arrangement. If the caves encode something, then the sealed chamber, if it exists, may contain the key to reading them. The element that makes the rest interpretable, the context without which the pattern remains pattern and nothing more. This may seem like an extravagant conjecture, but consider the parallel. The Rosetta Stone, the object that unlocked the entire system of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, was a relatively small piece of granodiorite, unremarkable in its physical properties, that happened to contain the same text in 3 scripts. Without it, Egyptian hieroglyphics might still be unreadable. The entire edifice of Egyptological knowledge rests, at its foundation, on a single object that happened to survive and happened to be found. How many equivalent objects have not survived? How many keys to lost systems of knowledge lie in sealed chambers that have not been opened, in spaces that have not been found, in passages that were deliberately closed by people who understood what they were protecting and chose protection over accessibility? The Longyou caves were found because a farmer drained a pond. The Terracotta Army was found because farmers drilled a well. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found because a shepherd threw a stone into a cave. The history of discovery is, to a significant extent, a history of accident, of the right person in the right place at the right moment, doing something ordinary that intersects with something extraordinary. The sealed chamber in the Longyou caves, if it exists, has not yet had its accident. No one has drained the right pond, drilled the right well, thrown the right stone, or perhaps the accident has occurred and its implications have not yet been fully processed. The radar surveys that suggested additional cavities were conducted. The results were noted. The follow-up investigation that would confirm or refute the presence of a sealed space has not been completed with the resources and access that the question would seem to warrant. Why not? The answer involves the same mixture of logistical, political, and institutional factors that slows investigation at almost every site we have examined. These are not sinister forces. They are the ordinary friction of doing difficult, expensive, politically sensitive work in a world where resources are finite and priorities compete. But the question waits, as questions do. Patient, specific, grounded in real evidence and real uncertainty. There is one more thing about the Longyou caves that deserves attention, something that is easy to overlook in the focus on scale and mystery, but that may be the most quietly remarkable feature of all. The caves are beautiful. Not incidentally, not accidentally, but deliberately and specifically beautiful. The patterned walls catch light in a way that changes as the angle of illumination changes, producing a surface that is never quite the same twice, that seems to shift and breathe as the observer moves. The pillars, positioned with structural precision, also create sightlines and spatial relationships that have an aesthetic quality, a composed quality, like the interior of a cathedral, where function and beauty have been so thoroughly integrated that separating them becomes meaningless. Whoever made these caves cared how they looked. They invested an enormous additional quantity of labor, beyond what structural necessity required, in making the surfaces visually extraordinary. This is not the behavior of people digging a military depot or a storage facility. It is the behavior of people creating a place that was meant to be experienced. Experienced by whom? For what purpose? In what context? The patterned walls do not answer these questions. The absent records do not answer them. The sealed passage, if opened, might, or it might reveal something so far outside the frameworks we currently use to understand the ancient world that the answers it provides generate more questions than it resolves. Wu Anai, the farmer who drained his pond in 1992, could not have anticipated what lay beneath the water. He was doing something practical, something ordinary, something that had nothing to do with archaeology or mystery, or the hidden capacities of ancient civilizations. He drained a pond and found a city of carved stone that no one had recorded, that no one had remembered, that no one had explained. 30 years later, we know more about the Longyou caves than Wu Anai knew when he first stood at the water's edge and watched the cave mouths emerge from the receding surface. We know less than we need to know. And somewhere in the deepest reach of those extraordinary chambers, behind a section of wall that may or may not be a door, in a darkness that the chiseled surfaces have kept since before recorded history thought to notice them, something waits for the next accident, the next farmer, the next drained pond, the next ordinary act that intersects without warning with the extraordinary. What will it find? Absence teaches us patience. The Longyou caves have waited beneath their ponds for what may be thousands of years, holding their secret in patterned stone, asking nothing of the surface world above them. They were not found by intention. They were not unlocked by scholarship or instrument or the systematic application of archaeological method. They were found because someone drained a pond. Because the ordinary world, going about its ordinary business, stumbled into something it was not looking for. This quality, the quality of the unexpected discovery, the mystery that reveals itself not when we are ready for it, but when the conditions happen to align, runs through the history of our understanding of the ancient world like a thread that connects sites and cultures and centuries into a single, ongoing conversation. And sometimes the discovery does not arrive by accident at all. Sometimes it arrives through water. Not still water, like the pond above Longyou, moving water. Dark water. Water that has been receiving the offerings of a civilization for more than 1,000 years, that has absorbed the prayers and the sacrifices and the deliberate silences of a people who understood, in ways that their surviving architecture only partially conveys, that certain thresholds are not meant to be crossed. From the surface, Chichén Itzá announces itself with a clarity that the Longyou caves never had. There is nothing hidden about its profile against the flat Yucatan sky. The great stepped pyramid known as El Castillo, the Temple of Kukulkan, rises 98 feet from the limestone plain, its 4 stairways of 91 steps each ascending to a single temple platform at its summit. On the spring and autumn equinoxes, the play of light and shadow on the pyramid's northern staircase produces the illusion of a serpent descending from the temple to the earth, a phenomenon so precisely engineered that it requires no interpretation. It simply appears, year after year, with the reliability of celestial mechanics, because the people who built this structure designed it to do exactly that. This is not a culture that did things accidentally. Chichén Itzá was one of the dominant cities of the Maya civilization, reaching its peak of power and influence somewhere between 600 and 1200 AD. At its height, it may have supported a population of 50,000 people, a figure that, as with Derinkuyu, carries a different weight when one is standing inside the space it describes. The city's architectural footprint covers approximately 4 square miles of cleared jungle, with major structures spread across a landscape that was organized, oriented, and deliberately composed. The astronomical precision embedded in its buildings is not incidental ornamentation. It is the primary language of the architecture. The Maya relationship with time, with the movements of celestial bodies, with the cycles of the calendar, with the alignment of human activity to cosmic pattern, was not a metaphorical commitment. It was an engineering discipline, and nowhere at Chichén Itzá is that discipline more evident or more consequential than in the structure that sits at the site's northern edge, the sacred cenote. A cenote is a natural sinkhole, a collapse in the limestone surface that exposes the underground water table beneath the Yucatan Peninsula. The peninsula has no rivers. Its water is entirely subterranean, moving through a vast network of underground channels and caves that the Maya understood, mapped, and incorporated into their cosmological framework with the same precision they applied to the stars. The sacred cenote at Chichén Itzá is roughly 200 feet in diameter. Its walls drop approximately 60 feet from the surface to the water below, which then descends to an additional depth of roughly 40 feet in its deepest portions. The water is dark, stained by the tannins of centuries of organic accumulation, and still in a way that moving water never is. It has the quality of a surface that absorbs light rather than reflecting it. For centuries, the precise duration is uncertain, but the archaeological evidence suggests a span of at least 500 years and possibly much longer. This cenote served as the primary site of sacrificial offering for the Maya of Chichén Itzá. Objects were thrown into its depths: jade ornaments, gold discs, copper bells, incense, rubber, carved bone, woven textiles, ceramics. And people, human beings, men, women, and children, were offered to the cenote in rituals whose specific protocols are not fully documented, but whose general character is attested in multiple sources. The cenote was understood to be an entrance, not a metaphorical entrance, a literal one. A passage to Xibalba, the Maya underworld, the place of the dead, the realm from which the rains came and to which the dead descended. Throwing something into the cenote was not disposal, it was delivery. A gift sent through a door that opened downward, into the dark water, to whatever waited on the other side. The first systematic dredging of the sacred cenote was conducted between 1904 and 1910 by Edward Herbert Thompson, an American diplomat and amateur archaeologist who had purchased the Chichén Itzá hacienda, specifically to gain access to the site. Thompson used a dredge to remove material from the cenote's floor, recovering an extraordinary assemblage of objects, jade, gold, copper, bone, that had accumulated over centuries of offering. Much of this material was removed from Mexico without authorization and eventually acquired by Harvard's Peabody Museum, creating a controversy that has not been fully resolved to this day. Thompson's dredge was crude and destructive. It churned through the accumulated layers of centuries without the stratigraphic care that modern archaeology would require. Much of what it recovered was damaged. Much of what it disturbed was lost. And what it did not recover, the material that remained at the cenote's margins, in its deeper recesses, in the areas the dredge could not reach, stayed in place. More rigorous investigations followed in the 1960s, when a team from the National Geographic Society conducted a systematic diving survey of the cenote using scuba equipment. Their findings added significantly to the catalog of recovered material and provided the first detailed map of the cenote's underwater topography. That topography revealed something that had not been apparent from the surface. The cenote floor is not flat. It is irregular, shaped by the geological processes of its formation and modified by centuries of accumulated deposits. In certain areas, the floor descends more steeply than in others, and at one point, at the far edge of the mapped area, where the visibility in the dark water was most limited, the divers noted what appeared to be a passage, a continuation of the underwater space leading beyond the cenote's main chamber into the limestone bedrock surrounding it. This is consistent with what is known about cenote geology. The underground water network beneath the Yucatan is extensive and interconnected. Cenotes are access points in a much larger system. It would be geologically unremarkable for the sacred cenote to connect, through underwater passages, to the broader network of subterranean channels beneath the site. But at Chichén Itzá, the geological and the sacred are not separate categories. The Maya did not choose the sacred cenote as a ritual site because it happened to be nearby. They chose it because of what it was: an entrance, a threshold, a place where the surface of the ordinary world opened into something else. And the underwater passage, if it leads where the geology of the region suggests it might lead, would not simply be a geological feature. It would be a continuation of the threshold, an extension of the entrance, a passage that goes deeper into Xibalba than the cenote itself. In 2015, a team of researchers announced results from an underwater survey conducted using sonar and remote sensing equipment beneath El Castillo, the Great Pyramid itself. What they found has not been fully published in the technical literature, but the preliminary reports described the detection of a cenote directly beneath the pyramid's foundation. A body of water, enclosed in a natural limestone cavity sitting at the base of the most important structure at Chichén Itzá. The pyramid was built over the water. This is not, in the context of Maya cosmology, a surprising finding. It is, in fact, the expected finding, the confirmation of something that researchers familiar with Maya architectural and religious thinking had long considered likely. The Maya built their most sacred structures at points of cosmological significance. A cenote, an entrance to the underworld, is precisely the kind of feature over which a temple of this importance would be built. But the confirmation of the underground cenote raised immediate questions about access. El Castillo has been known since early investigations to contain an earlier pyramid within its current exterior. a smaller structure preserved intact inside the later construction, accessible through an interior staircase that leads to a small temple chamber containing a red-painted jaguar throne inlaid with jade and a Chakmul sacrificial figure. This interior structure was a significant discovery when it was first accessed in the early 20th century. If there is a cenote beneath the pyramid, and the sonar evidence suggests there is, then it is likely accessible from somewhere within the pyramid's interior. A passage, a shaft, a staircase, a door. The Maya did not build sacred cenotes beneath sacred pyramids, and then failed to create a means of engaging with the connection between them. That passage, or door, has not been publicly identified or opened. The interior staircase that accesses the Jaguar throne chamber descends only so far. It does not reach the level at which the underground cenote would be located. Whether there is a continuation of that passage, sealed or concealed, that descends further, to the water, to the threshold, to the entrance to Xibalba, is a question that the available investigation has not answered. In 2016, Mexican archaeologists announced the discovery of a tunnel beneath the pyramid, identified through electrical resistivity tomography, a technique that maps subsurface variations in electrical conductivity and can detect both voids and water-filled spaces. The tunnel appeared to lead from a known ritual space at the pyramid's base toward the interior, in the direction of the underground cenote. The announcement was significant. The investigation that followed was slower than the announcement suggested it would be. Structural concerns about excavating beneath a major monument, concerns that are entirely legitimate, complicated the work. Political and institutional factors, familiar from every site we have examined, added their own complications. As of the most recent available information, the tunnel has not been fully excavated. The connection between the tunnel and the underground cenote has not been confirmed by direct investigation. The question of what, if anything, lies along that passage, and what, if anything, was placed at the point where the human-constructed tunnel meets the natural threshold of the water, remains open. But there is a tradition that speaks to this question more directly than the archaeological record currently can. The Chilam Balam, a series of Maya prophetic and historical texts compiled after the Spanish conquest from older oral and written sources, contains accounts of the sacred geography of Chichén Itzá that go beyond what the physical investigation has confirmed. These texts are not straightforward historical documents. They layer prophecy, cosmology, and historical memory in ways that require careful interpretation and that do not yield reliable, factual information in any simple sense. But they describe, among other things, a sealed chamber beneath El Castillo, a space understood to be the most sacred location at the site, accessible only to the highest-ranking ritual specialists, its contents known only to those who had undergone specific initiatory preparation. The chamber is described not as a storage space or a tomb, but as a place of encounter, a location where the boundary between the human world and Xibalba was so thin as to be almost non-existent. What was in this chamber? The texts are not specific in ways that translate cleanly into archaeological categories. They speak of objects of power, of records, of the accumulated knowledge of the calendrical and astronomical tradition that was the highest expression of Maya intellectual culture. They speak of things that were placed there to survive whatever disruption the surface world might undergo. The Spanish conquest was, for Maya civilization, precisely the kind of catastrophic disruption that the texts seem to anticipate. The conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century, and the project of destruction they undertook, of cities, of institutions, of the systems of knowledge that the priestly class had maintained for centuries, was thorough. Bishop Diego de Landa famously burned an unknown quantity of Maya books in 1562, an act he later partially documented in a manuscript that is, ironically, one of our primary sources for understanding the Maya calendar and writing system. How many books were burned, how much was lost, is not possible to determine. But what had been sealed underground, what had been placed behind a door that the Spanish did not know existed, in a chamber that the surface archaeology of their time could not locate, would not have been accessible to the fires. Is it still there? The sealed gate beneath El Castillo, whether it is the entrance to the tunnel identified by electrical tomography, or a different passage that has not yet been located, or the point at which the constructed tunnel meets the natural water of the underground cenote, has not been opened by any investigation that has been made publicly available. The pyramid stands above it, as it has stood for nearly 1,000 years, its equinox serpent descending the northern staircase twice a year with the reliability of the cosmos it was built to reflect. Below the staircase, below the foundation stones, below the earlier pyramid preserved within the later one, below the level at which the known passage terminates. The dark water of the underground cenote waits, and at the point where the human-built passage meets the natural threshold of the water, at the place where a civilization that understood the boundary between the living and the dead built the most sacred structure it knew how to build, directly over the entrance to the realm it feared and revered in equal measure, there is, or was, or may still be, a door. The Maya were precise people. They were people who embedded the movements of planets into the proportions of their buildings, who tracked the Venus cycle to an accuracy that took European astronomy centuries to match, who understood the mathematics of time in ways that modern scholars are still working to fully decode. They would not have left that threshold unmarked. They would not have left it unaddressed. They would not have failed to recognize what the geology of their sacred site provided them: a literal passage to the place their entire cosmological system was organized around. They did something at that threshold. They placed something there, or they sealed something there, or they inscribed something there that was meant to last beyond the disruptions of ordinary time. Whether it is objects or texts or architectural features that encode knowledge we have not yet learned to read, whatever they placed or sealed or inscribed at the point where their world met the world below, it is still there, waiting as the cenote has always waited in the dark water, patient in the way that only stone and water in the enclosed dark are patient, holding, in whatever form it takes, the last knowledge of a civilization that built its most enduring monument directly over the door to its underworld. What did the Maya know about what lies beneath El Castillo? And what would we understand? About them, about ourselves, about the relationship between what human civilizations choose to record and what they choose to seal away, if we were finally allowed to ask the question at the threshold itself? Water remembers. This is not mysticism, it is geology. The underground cenote beneath El Castillo at Chichén Itzá has absorbed the offerings of a civilization for centuries. Objects, prayers, the weight of human intention pressing down through the limestone into the dark. The water holds what was given to it. It does not give it back easily, and the sealed threshold at the point where the human-constructed passage meets the natural cavity of the earth continues to mark a boundary that no modern investigation has fully crossed. But the Maya were not alone in building their most sacred spaces at the intersection of the constructed and the natural. They were not alone in recognizing that certain locations carry a quality that demands architecture, that some places on the Earth's surface seem to call human beings toward them, again and again, across centuries and civilizations, as if the ground itself is asking to be acknowledged. There is a place in Upper Egypt, on the western bank of the Nile, roughly 40 miles north of Luxor, where this quality is so concentrated and so persistent that the same site has been considered sacred across a span of time that dwarfs almost any other continuously venerated location on Earth: the Dendera complex. To approach the Temple of Hathor at Dendera from the entrance road is to experience something that photographs do not adequately prepare one for. The temple's facade, its great hypostyle hall, its columns crowned with the four-faced visage of the goddess Hathor, her serene features repeated in every direction, has a scale and a completeness that most Egyptian temples, damaged by time and human intervention, no longer possess. Dendera survived, not perfectly, not without alteration, but with a structural integrity that allows the visitor to stand inside a space that feels, despite 2,000 years of intervening history, essentially as it was intended to feel. The temple as it stands today was constructed primarily during the Ptolemaic and early Roman periods, roughly 54 BC to 65 AD, on a site that had been sacred to Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, music, and the sky for far longer. Ancient texts found within the temple's own inscriptions refer to building plans drawn from documents that dated, those inscriptions claimed, to the reign of Pepi I of the 6th dynasty, approximately 2280 BC. Whether these claims reflect genuine archival continuity or the legitimizing rhetoric of later builders is a question that Egyptologists have debated without resolution. What is not debated is the site's antiquity as a place of veneration. Votive objects and architectural remains found at Dendera span the entire Pharaonic period and beyond. Whatever the specific history of the structures that preceded the current temple, human beings have been coming to this location, drawn by something about the place itself, for at least 4,000 years. The current temple is extraordinary in ways that reward careful attention. Its astronomical ceiling, painted in vivid pigment and divided into sections representing the hours of the night, the decans of the Egyptian astronomical calendar, and the movements of key celestial bodies, is one of the most complete surviving examples of ancient Egyptian cosmological art. The famous Dendera zodiac, a circular bas-relief representing the constellations, now housed in the Louvre after its removal in the early 19th century, was carved into the ceiling of one of the temple's roof chapels and represents the earliest surviving complete planisphere from the ancient world. The temple's walls are covered from floor to ceiling with inscribed texts and relief carvings of extraordinary density, ritual instructions, hymns, medical procedures, descriptions of sacred objects and their properties. The accumulated textual wealth of a religious tradition spanning centuries, encoded in stone with the evident intention that it should last indefinitely. And beneath this temple, beneath its foundations, beneath the accumulated layers of construction and reconstruction that the site has undergone across 4 millennia, there is a system of subterranean chambers and passages that has been known to Egyptologists since the 19th century, but that has not been fully investigated. The crypts of Dendera. Unlike the hidden shafts of the Great Pyramid or the sealed passage of the Osiris shaft, the crypts of Dendera are not entirely unknown or unacknowledged. They appear in the scholarly literature. They are referenced in tourist materials. Some of them have been entered, documented, and studied by qualified researchers. But the word "some" carries considerable weight in that sentence. The Dendera complex contains, by various estimates, 12 to 18 subterranean crypts, small, low-ceilinged chambers carved into the bedrock beneath the temple's foundations, accessible through hidden entrances in the temple walls and floors. These crypts were used, according to the religious texts that describe their function, for the storage of the most sacred objects of the temple cult, statues of the gods, ritual implements, the secret images that were carried in procession during specific festivals, and otherwise kept from ordinary sight. The crypts that have been entered and studied contain walls covered with relief carvings of exceptional quality, among them the famous Dendera reliefs that have attracted, for nearly 2 centuries, a level of interpretive controversy that mainstream Egyptology has found variously interesting, tedious, and difficult to definitively resolve. These reliefs depict elongated, bulbous objects, figures that, to a modern eye accustomed to a certain visual vocabulary, bear a striking resemblance to electric light bulbs or cathode ray tubes. Inside these bulbous forms, serpents are depicted in postures that some observers have interpreted as resembling the glowing filament of an incandescent lamp. The objects rest on pedestals and are attended by figures engaged in what the standard Egyptological interpretation identifies as ritual activity. The mainstream interpretation of these reliefs is clear and consistent. They represent the lotus flower from which the primordial serpent of creation emerged at the beginning of time. A well-attested Egyptian mythological motif, depicted here in a form specific to Dendera's Hathorian religious context. The resemblance to modern electrical devices is, on this reading, coincidental. A case of visual pattern recognition producing false connections across the genuine gap between ancient symbolic language and modern technological form. This is a reasonable position. The Egyptological interpretation has textual support. The lotus serpent motif is genuinely documented across multiple contexts in Egyptian religious art. But the debate, and there is a genuine debate, not merely a fringe assertion, has proven resistant to complete closure. Several researchers with relevant technical backgrounds have examined the reliefs and argued that the resemblance to electrical devices is not superficial pattern recognition, but reflects specific structural features. The internal positioning of the depicted elements, the nature of the pedestals on which the objects rest, certain details of the attending figure's posture and implements that are difficult to account for within the purely symbolic interpretation. This is not evidence of ancient electricity. It is evidence of an unresolved interpretive question, a feature of the Dendera crypts that continues to generate serious inquiry precisely because the mainstream explanation, while adequate, is not entirely satisfying to everyone who examines the evidence closely. The reliefs themselves are not the sealed mystery of Dendera. They are its most visible surface. The sealed mystery lies deeper. Among the subterranean chambers mapped at Dendera, there is a section of the crypt system that has not been publicly documented with the same thoroughness as the chambers containing the famous reliefs. References to this area appear in older Egyptological literature, in accounts from the 19th and early 20th centuries, when access to the site was less systematically regulated, in ways that suggest additional chambers beyond those that have been formally described and studied. These references are not consistent or detailed enough to construct a clear picture of what was found or where, but they recur with sufficient frequency to suggest that the researchers who made them were describing something real. Features of the subterranean system that their successors either could not access, chose not to discuss publicly, or found inaccessible due to collapses or deliberate sealing. The sealed entrance that concerns us most directly is not a grand gate of stone or bronze. It is more modest in its physical character, a blocked passage in the lower reaches of the crypt system, sealed in a manner consistent with the deliberate closure visible at other sites we have examined, located at a depth and position that the formal archaeological literature has not fully accounted for. What sealed it? When? By whom? These questions do not have publicly documented answers. The Dendera temple was not simply a place of worship in the modern sense. It was, by the account of its own inscriptions, a functioning center of medical practice, an institution where the healing arts associated with Hathor and, in the later periods, with Ihi and other medical deities were taught, practiced, and recorded. The temple contained what ancient texts describe as a per-ankh, a house of life, the Egyptian institutional equivalent of a library and scriptorium combined, where the most important texts of the religious and scientific tradition were copied, preserved, and consulted. What those texts contained, and where their physical copies ultimately went, is one of the standing questions of Egyptology. The Per-Ankh at Dendera would have held texts of extraordinary range: medical, astronomical, ritual, and what the Egyptians themselves described as the secret knowledge of Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom, whose accumulated learning was said to be encoded in a set of books of such importance that their possession conferred extraordinary power. These books, referred to in Greek sources as the Hermetic Books of Thoth, 42 in number by some accounts, covering everything from cosmology to medicine to the proper conduct of ritual, are among the most sought and most discussed lost texts of the ancient world. Their existence is attested in multiple independent sources. Their contents are partially reflected in surviving Hermetic literature of the Greco-Roman period. Their physical location, in the form of whatever original Egyptian documents underlay the later tradition, is unknown. Several researchers working across the intersection of Egyptology, the history of science, and the study of the Hermetic tradition have proposed that certain temple sites, Dendera among them, may have served as long-term repositories for exactly this kind of material. Not the libraries of the Per-Ankh in their ordinary operation, but the deeper archives, the sealed collections of texts too important and too sensitive for general accessibility, preserved in subterranean chambers specifically designed for their long-term survival. The environmental conditions of the Dendera crypts, sealed, underground, removed from the temperature fluctuations and humidity variations of the surface, are, in principle, favorable for the long-term preservation of papyrus and other organic writing materials. Not perfectly favorable, but sufficiently favorable that materials sealed there 2,000 years ago could, in principle, survive in legible condition. Could the sealed passage in the lower crypts of Dendera lead to a chamber containing texts? This is not a claim. It is a question, one that the available evidence neither supports nor refutes with any finality. It is a question that would require direct investigation to answer, and direct investigation has not been conducted, at least not in any form that has been made publicly available. There is one additional dimension of the Dendera mystery that deserves careful attention, one that connects the temple to the broader pattern we have been tracing across this entire exploration. The orientation of the Dendera temple is unusual. Most Egyptian temples of the Pharaonic period are aligned along an east-west axis, oriented toward the sunrise or toward specific astronomical events. Dendera is oriented differently, its main axis running approximately north-northwest to south-southeast, in an alignment that has been studied by archaeoastronomers and found to correspond to specific celestial targets that were significant in the Hathorian cult. This is not remarkable in itself. Different temples had different orientations for different ritual and astronomical reasons. What is remarkable is that the same orientation, extended beneath the temple's foundation, points toward a specific location in the subterranean crypt system, the very location where the sealed passage has been noted. Whether this alignment is intentional, whether the temple's orientation was chosen in part because it creates this underground vector, is a question that the evidence raises without answering. But in a tradition that embedded astronomical precision into every significant architectural decision, the coincidence of orientation and subterranean feature is the kind of thing that careful researchers tend not to dismiss. The Temple of Hathor stands today as one of the best preserved sacred complexes in Egypt. Its colors in the protected interiors retain a vibrancy that most Egyptian monuments lost to centuries of exposure. Its texts, carved deep into the stone, remain legible. The goddess's face, repeated on every column capital of the hypostyle hall, looks outward with an expression that contains, in its carved serenity, something that seems less like artistic idealization than genuine knowledge. the expression of someone who knows something that she is not, in this context, prepared to share. Below her, below the floor on which generations of pilgrims and priests and ritual specialists have walked, below the foundation stones laid by Ptolemaic builders following plans they claimed were thousands of years old, in the sealed lower reaches of a crypt system that the formal literature has not fully described, something waits. Perhaps it is nothing. Perhaps the sealed passage leads to a chamber that collapsed centuries ago under the weight of the stone above it. Perhaps it was sealed simply because it was structurally compromised, and the priests who closed it were motivated by nothing more mysterious than the practical recognition that a dangerous space should be marked and avoided. Perhaps, but Dendera has not, historically, rewarded the assumption of the prosaic. Every layer of investigation, from the first scholarly surveys of the 19th century to the archaeo-astronomical analyses of the 21st, has revealed something more than the previous layer suggested was there. The temple has a quality of inexhaustibility, of depth that does not diminish as it is explored, but seems, paradoxically, to increase. The sealed entrance in its lowest crypts represents the point at which that depth encounters a physical boundary. The point at which the known gives way to the unknown not gradually, through the fading of evidence and the accumulation of uncertainty, but sharply, at a surface of stone that was placed there by specific hands at a specific moment for a specific reason. What was that reason? What did the priests of Hathor, inheritors of a tradition that claimed to reach back 4,000 years, custodians of texts that Greek writers regarded as the foundational library of human wisdom, practitioners of a medical and astronomical science that continued to influence the world long after their institution was absorbed and transformed by successive conquering cultures? What did they seal away in the deepest chamber of their most enduring temple? And is it possible that the question itself, the fact that we are still asking it, 2,000 years after the last priest of Hathor closed the door and turned away from it, is exactly what they intended? Not a loss, not a failure of preservation, but a design. A sealed question maintained in stone, waiting for the moment when whoever finds it is prepared not merely to open the door, but to understand what they find on the other side. What is behind the sealed entrance at Dendera, and are we yet ready to know? Readiness is a recurring theme. The priests of Hathor sealed their deepest chamber and left behind a question encoded in stone, not a barrier against all inquiry perhaps, but a threshold calibrated to the depth of understanding required to engage with what lay beyond it. They were not the only ancient custodians who thought this way. Across the sites we have visited again and again, the act of sealing carries this quality of intention, of a decision made not in haste or fear alone, but in the considered recognition that some things should wait for the right moment, the right understanding, the right preparation. But there is a difference between a sealed chamber maintained by a priestly institution, an organization that persisted, that remembered, that kept the tradition of the seal alive even as it kept the seal itself, and a sealed gate created by a single act of absolute finality. A closure so complete, so deliberately permanent, that the very people who built it were incorporated into the sealing itself, made part of the barrier, transformed from builders into guardians by the simple act of not being allowed to leave. We have visited the tomb of Qin Shi Huang once already in this exploration. We stood at its outer perimeter, considered the terracotta army, traced the mercury in the soil, and contemplated the stone gate that stands between the modern world and the burial chamber of China's first emperor. But that earlier visit was an introduction, a surface reading of a mystery whose full dimensions require a closer approach. Because the stone gate at the entrance to the burial chamber is not the only sealed threshold within the Qin tomb complex. It is not even the most significant one. and the question of what specifically was placed behind the innermost gate, placed there by people who understood that they would never leave, who sealed it from inside knowing that inside was where they would remain, is a question that deserves to be examined with the full weight of everything we have learned since we first encountered this hill on the Shanxi Plain. Return, then, to the mound. It rises from the plain east of Xi'an with the same quiet authority it has always had. Too symmetrical for a natural formation, too large for casual explanation, too persistent for the accumulated weight of 23 centuries to diminish. The farmers still work the fields around its base, as their ancestors have worked them for 2,000 years. The tourists gather at the terracotta warrior pits a mile away, moving through those extraordinary underground halls with the subdued awe that the occasion demands, and the mound itself remains essentially untouched. This is, when one considers it carefully, a remarkable fact. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang has been known, continuously without interruption, since the day it was completed. It has never been forgotten, it has never been lost. There has been no dramatic rediscovery, no accidental stumbling upon a forgotten entrance. The mound has sat above the burial complex for 23 centuries, known to every dynasty that ruled China in its wake, known to every foreign traveler who passed through the region, known to the scholars and officials and military commanders and emperors who came after the first emperor and understood exactly what lay beneath the earth they were standing on. And in all that time, across all those centuries of continuous knowledge, no one has opened the gate. This is not for lack of capability. China has, at various points in its history, possessed the organizational capacity to undertake an excavation of this scale. The question of opening the tomb has been raised and discussed in serious institutional contexts. The decision, consistently, has been not to proceed. Why? The official answer, the one offered by the Chinese government and by the archaeologists who work within its framework, is the one we have already examined. The preservation technology does not yet exist to excavate and protect the contents without causing irreversible damage. The lesson of the terracotta warriors, whose colors began to fade within minutes of exposure to air, is cited regularly and sincerely. This is a real consideration. It carries genuine weight. It is not a pretext, but it is not the complete answer. And the aspects of the answer that remain unstated are, in certain respects, more interesting than the stated ones. Sima Qian's account of the tomb's construction, the same account that described the mercury rivers, the gem-studded ceiling, the mechanical crossbow traps, also describes the final act of the burial with a specificity that no subsequent historian has found reason to substantially contradict. When the emperor's body had been interred and the burial goods arranged, the inner gates of the tomb were closed. The craftsmen and artisans who had worked on the innermost chambers, the people who knew where the traps were, who understood the layout of the passages, who could, in principle, have led others to the burial chamber or recreated its contents from memory, were sealed inside with the emperor. The outer mound was then piled over the entrance. Trees were planted to make it resemble a natural hill, and the people who had built the tomb, who had spent years of their lives creating the most extraordinary burial complex in the history of Chinese civilization, became part of it. This detail has always been treated as the most disturbing element of the Qin tomb's history. It is disturbing. The human cost embedded in that hill is not a metaphor, but it is also, from the perspective of our inquiry, the most informative element, because it tells us something specific about what Qin Shi Huang, or the officials acting on his instructions, believed was inside the burial chamber. Whatever was in there was worth this, worth the systematic elimination of everyone who had seen it, worth the transformation of a workforce into a permanent seal. What would justify that decision? The mercury rivers are remarkable, but they do not justify it. Mercury was valuable, but not so secret that its use in a tomb required the death of those who poured it. The jade suits, the bronze weapons, the gold and silver objects, none of these, individually or collectively, required the kind of secrecy that only death could guarantee. The crossbow traps, the mechanical devices described by Chichén as designed to fire at intruders, suggest a specific anxiety about unauthorized access. Someone, at the planning stage of the tomb's construction, considered in concrete detail the scenario of people attempting to enter after the burial was complete and designed a lethal countermeasure. This is not the behavior of people protecting ordinary funerary goods. What were they protecting? Here, the historical record, normally so rich in detail about the Qin period, develops a particular quality of reticence. The administrative documents that survive from Qin governance, inscriptions on bronze, records on bamboo strips, the texts preserved in Sima Qian's later compilation, are specific about many aspects of the first emperor's reign. His military campaigns, his administrative reforms, his obsessive pursuit of immortality, his consultations with scholars and magicians and alchemists, but about the specific contents of the tomb's innermost chamber, beyond the general descriptions of wealth and the mention of specific structural features, the sources fall quiet in a way that feels less like ignorance and more like discretion. What the sources do discuss, repeatedly and from multiple angles, is the emperor's preoccupation with immortality and his relationship with a specific body of knowledge. Qin Shi Huang dispatched expeditions to find the Islands of the Immortals, mythological locations in the Eastern Sea where beings who had transcended ordinary human limitations were said to dwell. He employed scholars who claimed knowledge of the methods by which this transcendence could be achieved. He consumed substances prepared by these scholars, preparations of mercury and other materials, in the belief that they would extend his life beyond its natural limits. He was, in this pursuit, absolutely serious. Not metaphorically serious, not symbolically committed to an ideal of transcendence, practically, urgently, operationally serious. He wanted to live forever, and he was willing to apply the full resources of the most powerful state in the world to achieving that goal. The scholars he employed, the Fangxi, practitioners of a tradition of esoteric knowledge that incorporated astronomy, medicine, divination, and what we might loosely translate as alchemy, were not charlatans in the simple sense. They were custodians of a body of knowledge whose full extent is not preserved in any publicly available source. They worked within a tradition that claimed, through texts and oral transmission, to encode the accumulated understanding of a very long line of predecessors. What did that tradition actually contain? The portion of it that has survived into the historical record, the texts that were preserved through the Qin period's notorious burning of books and emerged in the Han Dynasty that followed, represents, by the account of later scholars, only a fraction of what existed. The book Burning of 213 BC, ordered by the first emperor on the advice of his minister Li Si, targeted precisely the kind of esoteric and historical texts that the Fangxi tradition depended on. The officially sanctioned destruction was extensive, but not complete. The emperor would not have destroyed texts that he considered valuable for his own purposes. The knowledge he was actively seeking, the methods of transcendence, the accumulated understanding of the Fangxi tradition, would not have been burned. It would have been preserved, gathered, concentrated. And when the emperor died in 210 BC, still pursuing immortality, still waiting for the expeditions to the Eastern Sea to return with what he had sent them to find, what happened to that knowledge? The conventional answers that it dispersed, that the Fangxi tradition continued underground, its practitioners adapting to the new conditions of Han Dynasty governance, preserving what they could in forms that would eventually emerge as the foundations of Taoist philosophy and Chinese medical theory. This may be correct, it probably is, at least partially, but there is another possibility that the evidence does not exclude, that the most significant portion of that accumulated knowledge, the texts and instruments and objects that represented the innermost core of what the Fangxi understood, was placed in the burial chamber of the man who had devoted the full resources of his empire to pursuing its implications, sealed inside with the craftsman who had built the chamber to contain it, protected by mechanical traps, buried under a hill designed to last as long as the dynasty its builder had named eternal. This possibility, that the innermost chamber of the Qin tomb is not primarily a repository of wealth but a repository of knowledge, is not a fringe proposition. It has been raised in various forms by serious scholars of Chinese history and the history of Chinese science. It is consistent with the known character of the first emperor and with the known priorities of his court. It would explain the extraordinary measures taken to ensure the chamber's permanent inaccessibility. It would also explain something else, something that becomes visible only when one considers the Qin tomb in the context of the other sealed spaces we have examined in this exploration. Across every site we have visited, the vaults of Padmanabhaswamy, the subterranean city of Derinkuyu, the crypts of Dendera, the chambers of Chichén Itzá, a consistent pattern has emerged. The most carefully sealed spaces are not the ones that contain wealth in the conventional sense. They are the ones that contain knowledge, understanding, the accumulated intellectual inheritance of a civilization at its most concentrated and its most vulnerable. Gold can be remelted. Jade can be recarved. The material wealth of an ancient civilization, once removed from its original context, retains its value in a different form. Knowledge cannot be remelted. A text destroyed is gone. A method lost is lost. An understanding sealed away from the tradition that gave it context cannot simply be reconstructed from the outside. The people who sealed these spaces understood this distinction. They were not protecting treasure in the ordinary sense. They were protecting something more fundamental, the accumulated understanding of civilizations that knew, with varying degrees of clarity and urgency, that what they had learned was at risk. In 2021, a new phase of scientific investigation of the Qin tomb complex produced results that received relatively limited coverage outside specialist circles, but that carry considerable significance. Researchers using advanced Muon tomography, the same technique that detected the hidden void in the Great Pyramid, conducted surveys of the burial mound from multiple angles. The results confirmed the presence of the main burial chamber, consistent with previous ground-penetrating radar data. They also detected additional anomalies, smaller voids distributed in a pattern around the central chamber, whose nature and contents have not been publicly interpreted in detail. Whether these anomalies represent subsidiary chambers, structural features of the tomb's construction, or something that does not fit neatly into either category, the published data does not make clear. What is clear is that the mound contains more than has been directly investigated, that the map of what lies beneath that hill is still incomplete, that the stone gate we identified in our earlier visit is one threshold among several, and that the relationships between those thresholds, the spatial logic of the innermost complex, have not yet been fully decoded. The hill stands in the Shanxi Plain as it has always stood. The emperor within it has been waiting for 23 centuries, longer, by several orders of magnitude, than any other figure we have encountered in this exploration. The mercury, if Sima Qian is accurate, still flows through channels cut in stone by hands that were sealed in with it. And the innermost gate, the one that the craftsman closed from the inside, the one protected by mechanical traps, the one that the full power of the Chinese state has consistently, across decades of modern archaeology, chosen not to open, remains exactly where they left it. Closed, locked, permanent in its closure in a way that no other sealed gate we have examined quite matches, because the permanence here was written not only in stone but in human lives. In the decision, made by someone with the authority to make it, that the secret of what was inside was worth more than the lives of everyone who knew it. What secret is worth that? What did Qin Shi Huang place in the chamber beneath his hill? What did he gather and seal and protect with mechanical traps and human sacrifice and 23 centuries of institutional restraint that still, today, no one has been permitted to bring back into the light? And when the day finally comes, when the technology is ready, when the politics align, when the decision is made to open the innermost gate of the first emperor's tomb, what will we find waiting in the dark behind a door that was sealed by people who were not allowed to leave? Will it be treasure? Will it be knowledge? Or will it be something for which we do not yet have a category? Something that the ancient world understood and encoded and preserved precisely because it recognized that the world it was leaving behind was not yet ready to receive it. The hill waits, the gate holds, and the answer, whatever it is, continues its vigil in the enclosed dark, patient as only stone and sealed time can be patient, keeping it secret for the moment when someone is finally, genuinely ready to ask the right question. Are we there yet? There?